The snarls came first, low and hungry. Eleanor Wright's gloved fingers tightened around the handle of her father's old shotgun. Through the swirling snow, yellow eyes reflected the dim lantern light, five, no, six pairs moving in a restless semicircle around her and the remaining cattle. "Get back!" Her voice cracked against the howling wind, thin and desperate even to her own ears. The lead wolf, a gaunt, battle-scarred creature, took a deliberate step forward, testing her resolve. Eleanor cocked the shotgun, its mechanism stiff from the bitter cold. She'd saved her last two shells for this moment, knowing they wouldn't be enough. 2 years ago, she might have dropped to her knees and surrendered to whatever fate God had planned. But 18 months of widowhood had burned away such yielding impulses. She would not die cowering. "Come on, then," she whispered, aiming at the lead wolf. The beast tensed haunches, lowering in preparation to spring. Behind her, the cattle shifted nervously, their warm breath forming clouds in the frigid Montana air. The Silver Creek Valley had never felt so vast and empty, the nearest neighbor 3 miles away, the town twice that distance. The wolf launched itself just as the storm swallowed the lantern's flame, plunging everything into darkness. Eleanor fired blindly. The sound that followed wasn't the yelp of a wounded animal, but a startled grunt, human male, and entirely unexpected. A massive shadow moved between her and the wolves. The silhouette was impossibly broad, towering over both her and the predators. A mountain brought to life. "Easy now," the deep voice rumbled, not directed at her, but at the wolves. Through the driving snow, she watched as the giant figure stood perfectly still, facing the wolf pack, without weapon or fear. One massive hand extended slowly, palm down, in a gesture of dominance rather than peace. The lead wolf hesitated, then retreated a step, then another. "They're hungry, not evil," the man said, his voice carrying easily despite the wind. "But they won't bother your cattle tonight." As if to confirm his words, the pack melted away into the whiteness of the blizzard, silent as spirits. Only then did the stranger turn toward her. The lantern, miraculously reignited in his other hand, illuminated a face that belonged in ancient tales of gods walking among mortals. Weathered skin stretched over high cheekbones and a strong jaw darkened with several days' growth of beard. But it was his eyes that held her, pale blue, almost translucent in the lantern light, and filled with a quiet understanding that seemed to take in everything about her situation in a single glance. "You nearly shot me, Mrs. Wright." There was no accusation in his tone, merely a statement of fact. Eleanor lowered the shotgun, suddenly aware of how badly her hands were shaking. "How do you know my name?" "Same way I know you've been training to run this ranch alone since Michael died in that mine collapse." He took a step closer, and she realized just how enormous he truly was, nearly 7.5 feet of solid muscle and bone. Folk talk, especially about a woman too stubborn to accept help or sense. The cattle, inexplicably calm in his presence, had gathered behind him as if seeking protection. The storm was worsening, sheets of snow now driving horizontally across the pasture. "We need to get these animals to shelter," he said, already moving to herd the small group toward the barn. "Storm's turning deadly." Eleanor should have been frightened, or at least wary of this stranger who appeared from nowhere, who knew her name and circumstances. Instead, she found herself following his lead, guiding the cattle through the deepening snow toward the relative warmth of the barn. "I don't know your name," she managed between labored breaths, the cold air burning her lungs. "Jackson Thornhill." He secured the barn door behind the last steer, shutting out the worst of the wind. "I have land up on Pine Ridge." The name meant nothing to her, though she'd heard rumors of a reclusive giant who'd built a homestead high in the mountains. Most had dismissed it as another tall tale in a territory filled with exaggerations. In the shelter of the barn, she could see him more clearly. His size was intimidating. Yes, but there was nothing threatening in his manner. A jagged scar ran from his right temple down to his jaw and disappearing into his beard, the mark of a man who'd faced violence and survived. His clothes were well made but practical, heavy wool coat, sturdy trousers tucked into boots that had seen many miles. "Why are you here, Mr. Thornhill?" Eleanor brushed snow from her coat, suddenly conscious of her appearance, hair escaping its pinned cheeks, flushed with cold and exertion. Jackson studied her for a long moment before answering. "I've been watching you, Mrs. Wright." The words should have chilled her more thoroughly than the blizzard, but the way he said them, with a simple honesty devoid of menace, made them something else entirely. "Watching me for several weeks now." He moved to check on the cattle, his enormous hands surprisingly gentle, as he examined a calf for signs of frostbite. Watching you chop wood until your hands bleed. Watching you mend fences in freezing rain. Watching you stretch dwindling supplies while the town whispers about when you'll finally give up. Eleanor's throat tightened. I don't recall inviting an audience to my struggles, Mr. Thornhill. No, he agreed, straightening to his full height. But I've seen enough to know what I came here to say. Something in his tone made her heart beat faster. Outside, the wind howled like a living thing rattling the barn's timbers. Your roof is leaking in 3 places, he continued. Your smokehouse needs repairs before spring. The north pasture fence won't last another month. And you're down to your last sack of flour. Each observation struck like a physical blow, not because they were intrusive, but because they were true. Truths she'd been hiding from neighbors and shopkeepers, maintaining a facade of managing just fine. What exactly is your point? Pride made her voice sharper than intended. My point, Mrs. Wright, is that you won't survive another year alone. He said it without cruelty, the same way one might observe an approaching storm. And I'm proposing a solution. The image came unbidden, this giant of a man with his capable hands fixing her roof, mending fences, bringing stability to her crumbling world. For a moment, the temptation to simply accept whatever help he offered was overwhelming. But Eleanor Wright had not survived 18 months of widowhood by accepting charity. I don't need saving, Mr. Thornhill. No, he agreed, surprising her. You don't need saving, you need partnership. Before she could respond, he reached into his coat and withdrew a small, leather-bound notebook. Your husband kept records of everything. Debts, plans, hopes. He held it out to her. Found this in town. Thought you should have it. Eleanor took the notebook with numb fingers, immediately recognizing Michael's neat handwriting. She'd been searching for his account since his death, assuming they'd been lost in the mine collapse. How did you... That's not important now. Jackson glanced toward the barn door where snow was beginning to drift under the frame. What matters is that we get you back to the house before this storm worsens. We can continue this conversation somewhere warmer. The house was dark and cold when they finally reached it, fighting through snowdrifts that reached Eleanor's waist. Jackson moved with efficiency, building a fire in the hearth while she lit the lamps. The familiar room seemed transformed by his presence, suddenly smaller and shabbier than she remembered. You should change into dry clothes, he said, his back to her as he coaxed the flames higher. I'll make coffee. The normality of the suggestion, as if they'd shared this routine 100 times before, snapped Eleanor back to the strangeness of her situation. This man, this giant stranger, was in her home giving her instructions, having apparently been watching her for weeks. Mr. Thornhill, she straightened her spine, summoning every ounce of dignity she possessed. I appreciate your assistance with the wolves and getting the cattle to safety, but I think it's time you explained exactly why you're here. He turned from the fireplace firelight, casting dramatic shadows across the planes of his face. For the first time, she noticed the weariness in his eyes. Not physical exhaustion, but something deeper and older. I'm here because I'm tired of being alone, he said simply, and because you're the strongest woman I've ever seen. Outside, the blizzard raged, sealing them together in this moment of unexpected honesty. I'm 34 years old, Mrs. Wright. I have good land, healthy livestock, and a house built to withstand whatever these mountains throw at it. He spoke with the careful precision of a man who had rehearsed these words many times. What I don't have is family. What I don't have is someone to build a life with. Understanding dawned slowly then, all at once. Mr. Thornhill, are you? I'm proposing marriage, yes. His gaze remained steady, unflinching. A partnership between equals. I'm not looking for a housekeeper or a convenient arrangement. I'm looking for a wife who understands what it means to fight for something that matters. Eleanor's legs suddenly felt unable to support her. She sank into the nearest chair, Michael's notebook clutched against her chest like a shield. You don't know me, she finally managed. I know enough. He remained standing, his massive frame casting a long shadow across the wooden floor. I know you were the only child of Reverend Wright before he moved east to Boston. I know you haven't attended church since your mother died in childbirth when you were 12. I know your marriage to Michael was childless, though not for lack of hoping. Each personal detail felt like an invasion, yet his tone held no judgment, only a quiet acknowledgement of the experiences that had shaped her. And what do I know of you? She countered. A stranger who appears from nowhere who admits to watching me for weeks. Why should I trust anything you say? Jackson reached into his coat again this time, withdrawing an ornate pocket watch. The gold case caught the firelight as he opened it, revealing a timepiece clearly of significant age and craftsmanship. This belonged to my grandfather, who brought it from Scotland in 1811. He held it so she could see the intricate engravings on its surface. He carried it through 40 years of frontier life, through the births of 8 children and the deaths of 3. When he gave it to my father, he said it wasn't just for telling time, but for remembering that every moment matters, especially the ones that shape our future. Eleanor found herself drawn to the watch despite her reservations. It's beautiful. My father carried it until he died at Antietam. Jackson's voice grew quieter. Confederate artillery. I was serving with the Union forces, couldn't get to him in time. The revelation that he was a veteran explained something of his demeanor, the watchfulness, the economy of movement, the eyes that seemed to have seen too much. I'm sorry for your loss, she said automatically. It was a long time ago. He closed the watch and returned it to his pocket. The point is, Mrs. Wright, I'm not offering you pretty words or empty promises. I'm offering you honesty and partnership. I'm offering you a future that doesn't depend on whether you can stretch your supplies until spring. And what do you expect in return? The question was blunt but necessary. Children. His answer was equally direct. Before spring arrives, I want you carrying my child. The boldness of his statement should have shocked her, perhaps even offended her. Instead, it sent an unexpected warmth through her chest, followed immediately by cold dread. That may not be possible. She looked away, unable to meet his eyes. Michael and I tried for years. Perhaps you needed the right man to plant the seed. The matter-of-fact way he spoke about such intimate matters made them somehow easier to discuss. Either way, we won't know until we try. Eleanor felt heat rise in her cheeks. You speak very confidently for a man proposing to a woman he barely knows. I'm not a young boy stumbling through courtship, Mrs. Wright. I know what I want, and I see no point in pretending otherwise. He moved to add another log to the fire. I'm proposing that before spring, you'll have my child growing inside you, and by summer, you'll have a family again. The certainty in his voice stirred something long dormant within her. Not just physical desire, but the ache of hope she'd thought permanently extinguished when she'd stood beside Michael's hastily dug grave. And if I refuse, then I'll leave when the storm breaks and you'll never see me again. He turned back to face her, his expression grave. I won't force my presence where it isn't wanted, but consider your options carefully, Mrs. Wright. Winter's coming, whether we're ready or not. Eleanor opened Michael's notebook, needing something to focus on besides Jackson's intense gaze. The familiar handwriting blurred before her eyes as she turned the pages past records of cattle sales and supply purchases until a particular entry caught her attention. November 18th. Borrowed 1,000 from H. 6 months to repay. God help me if E ever finds out. H, she murmured, scanning the subsequent pages for clarification. There was none. What is it? Jackson moved closer, his shadow falling across the page. Eleanor closed the notebook quickly. Nothing important. But her mind was racing. Michael had taken on debt he'd hidden from her from someone identified only as H. And who was E herself? But why would Michael use her initial rather than wife, as he did elsewhere in his notes? The questions would have to wait. Right now, she had a more immediate decision to face. I need time to think, she said finally. Jackson nodded as if he'd expected nothing less. Of course, this isn't a decision to make hastily. He glanced toward the window where snow continued to accumulate against the glass. The storm will keep us both here until morning at least. You can give me your answer then. The practicality of his response was somehow more disconcerting than if he'd pressed for an immediate answer. This man, this stranger who'd watched her struggle from afar, who now proposed marriage and children, with the same straightforward approach one might use to suggest a business arrangement, he was unlike anyone she'd ever encountered. Where will you sleep? The question slipped out before she could consider how it might sound. A smile touched the corner of his mouth for the first time, brief but transformative, softening the hard angles of his face. I've slept in worse places than a kitchen chair, Mrs. Right? Don't concern yourself. As if to demonstrate, he settled his large frame into one of her sturdy wooden chairs, looking surprisingly at ease despite the cramped quarters. You should get some rest. Tomorrow will bring decisions enough. Eleanor hesitated, then retreated to her bedroom, taking Michael's notebook with her. She did not expect to sleep yet. Exhaustion claimed her almost immediately, dragging her into dreams filled with wolf snow and a pair of pale blue eyes that seemed to see straight through to her soul. Morning arrived with unnatural stillness. The storm had passed during the night, leaving behind a world transformed by snow and silence. Eleanor dressed quickly, her fingers clumsy with cold and nerves. She'd woken with unexpected clarity about what she must do, though the prospect filled her with equal parts terror and strange anticipation. Jackson was already awake, tending to a fresh fire in the hearth. The aroma of coffee filled the small house, and she noticed he'd somehow managed to prepare a simple breakfast as well, biscuits warming by the fire, their smell triggering a sharp pang of hunger she hadn't felt in months. "You didn't need to cook," she said, suddenly aware of how her hair must look hastily pinned and still tangled from sleep. "Seemed the least I could do." He poured coffee into her chipped porcelain cup, his enormous hands making the delicate object appear toy-like. Storms passed, but there's 3 feet of snow on the level ground. More in drifts. Eleanor accepted the coffee, noticing he had remembered to leave room for milk, though how he knew her preference was yet another mystery. "I need to check the cattle." "Already did. They're fine. Fed them some of your remaining hay." He settled across from her at the small table, his own coffee black and steaming. "You've made your decision." It wasn't a question. "I have conditions," she said, meeting his gaze directly. Something flickered in his eyes, respect perhaps, or amusement. "Name them." 1 month. She set her cup down carefully. "We live together for 1 month before any formal commitment. I keep my name until a proper ceremony, and I keep this house as security." Security against what? Against the possibility that this arrangement doesn't work. She straightened her shoulders. "I need to know I have somewhere to return to if we find we're not compatible." Jackson considered this, his expression unreadable. 1 month is reasonable, but winter's coming fast. We should move to my property before the mountain passes become impassable. You haven't agreed to my other terms. I haven't disagreed either. He leaned forward slightly. I have no objection to you keeping your name until a ceremony, though I'd prefer that ceremony happen sooner rather than later. As for this house, his gaze traveled around the room, taking in the patched walls, the sagging roof beams, the general air of slow decay. It's yours. Keep it as long as you need to feel secure. The simple acceptance of her terms without argument or negotiation was unexpected. Eleanor had prepared for resistance, had fortified herself for a battle of wills. "Why me?" she asked, the question that had been burning since his arrival. "There are younger women in town, unmarried women with families to recommend them." Jackson's answer came without hesitation. "Because when I watched you split wood with bleeding hands, I saw a woman who doesn't surrender. That's worth more than youth or family connections." The honest assessment stripped away any pretense that this might be a romantic arrangement. Jackson Thornhill wanted her for her strength, her determination, not for beauty or passion. The realization was both disappointing and strangely liberating. "When would we leave?" "Tomorrow, if possible. The weather may hold for a few days, enough of time to pack what you need and make arrangements for this property." Tomorrow. The immediacy of it made her proposal suddenly frighteningly real. "I'll need to speak with Margaret Thompson," Eleanor said, thinking aloud. "She can keep an eye on the house, maybe use the pasture for her own cattle until spring." Jackson nodded, rising from the table with fluid grace despite his size. "I have preparations to make as well. I'll return in the morning with a wagon for your belongings." He reached for his coat, then paused. "Unless you've changed your mind." "No." The firmness of her own response surprised her. "No, I haven't changed my mind." He studied her face for a moment longer, as if memorizing its contours, then nodded once and headed for the door. The morning sunlight caught his profile as he turned, highlighting the rugged scar that marked his otherwise handsome features. "Mr. Thornhill," she called as he stepped onto the porch. "You never asked my first condition." He looked back, one eyebrow raised in question. "My first name is Eleanor." She managed a small smile. "If we're to be partners, you should use it." "Eleanor." He spoke the name carefully, testing its sound. "I'm Jackson." With that simple exchange, something shifted between them, not quite intimacy, but the acknowledgement that whatever lay ahead, they would face it as individuals with names and histories, not merely convenient solutions to each other's problems. After he left, Eleanor sank back into her chair, wondering if she'd just made the most desperate or the wisest decision of her life. Margaret Thompson's reaction was exactly what Eleanor had expected: initial shock, followed by concern barely disguised as practical questions. Marriage. Margaret set down her teacup with enough force to splash liquid onto the tablecloth. To Jackson Thornhill, the giant from Pine Ridge who barely speaks 2 words at the general store, Eleanor had made the difficult journey to the Thompson farm as soon as the path was passable, knowing she needed to speak with her closest friend before rumors spread through Silver Creek. "It's not a traditional arrangement," she admitted, watching Margaret's expressive face cycle through disbelief, worry, and reluctant understanding. "It's a partnership, practical for both of us." Margaret was a handsome woman in her early 40s with streaks of silver in her dark hair and laugh lines that spoke of a life well lived despite its hardships. She and her husband, Carl, had taken Eleanor under their wing after Michael's death, providing support without charity, a distinction Eleanor deeply appreciated. "There's nothing practical about binding yourself to a stranger, Eleanor." Margaret reached across the table to grasp her hand. "Especially not a man who looks like he does." "You mean because of his size?" Eleanor felt oddly defensive. "Or the scar?" "Both, if I'm being honest. There are stories about him, you know. Some say he was a Union soldier who went berserk after Antietam killed dozens of Confederate soldiers with his bare hands. He told me his father died at Antietam." Eleanor withdrew her hand gently. "He was there, yes, but that doesn't make him a monster." Margaret sighed, her expression softening. "I'm not saying he is, but marriage, Eleanor? You barely know him. I knew Michael for 2 years before we married and still discovered he'd been keeping secrets." The bitterness in her voice surprised them both. Eleanor hadn't meant to mention the mysterious debt she'd discovered in the notebook, but now it slipped out. "Did you know Michael borrowed money, a significant amount, shortly before he died?" Margaret's slight hesitation told Eleanor everything. "You knew." "I suspected." Margaret busied herself refilling their teacups. "Carl mentioned seeing Michael talking with some businessman from Helena. Very hush-hush. But Michael never confided in us about any loans. The entry only mentions H and a sum of $1,000. Eleanor's hands tightened around her cup. "Due 6 months after the date of the entry, which would have been May," Margaret finished quietly, "the month after he died." The timing hadn't escaped Eleanor's notice. Whatever debt Michael had incurred, its deadline had passed while she was still deep in grief, possibly unaware of its existence. "Did this H ever come to collect?" Margaret asked. "Not that I know of." Eleanor pushed the troubling thoughts aside. "But that's not why I'm here. I need to ask a favor." Margaret's expression grew wary. "What kind of favor?" "Would you and Carl consider watching over my property while I'm away? Use the pasture for your cattle if you'd like. I just need to know it's not sitting and abandoned." The request seemed to confirm Margaret's fears about the hasty arrangement. "You are keeping your property as insurance. You don't truly trust this man." "It's not about trust." But even as she said it, Eleanor knew it wasn't entirely true. "It's about being practical." There's nothing practical about moving to a remote mountain homestead with a man who's practically a stranger, especially with winter coming. Margaret's concern was evident in every line of her face. "What happens if things go wrong? If he's not the man you think he is?" The questions echoed Eleanor's own doubts, but she'd made her decision. "That's why I'm keeping my property. That's why we're waiting a month before any formal commitment." Margaret studied her for a long moment. "There's something you're not telling me." Eleanor looked away, unable to meet her friend's perceptive gaze. How could she explain the inexplicable sense of rightness she'd felt when Jackson had laid out his proposal? How could she articulate the way his direct approach had cut through months of proud pretense and lonely struggling? "He wants children," she said finally. "He believes I can give them to him despite the years of disappointment with Michael, despite the growing certainty that she might be barren, despite the fear that had taken root after her mother's death in childbirth, the terrifying possibility that pregnancy might be her own death sentence, just as it had been for her mother. Understanding dawned in Margaret's eyes. Oh, Eleanor. The simple acknowledgement nearly broke her composure. Margaret knew better than most the complex emotions surrounding childbearing. The Thompsons had lost their firstborn son to fever when he was barely 2 years old. Though they'd gone on to have two healthy daughters now grown and married, the loss had left its mark. What if he's right? Eleanor whispered. What if all this time it wasn't me who couldn't conceive? What if it was Michael? The possibility had haunted her through a restless night. Michael had been sickly as a child, prone to winter ailments that left him weakened. What if his seed had been similarly compromised? And what if he's wrong? Margaret countered gently. What if you bind yourself to this man, move to his isolated homestead, and still can't give him the children he so clearly wants? What then? It was the question Eleanor had avoided asking herself. Then at least I'll have tried. At least I'll know. Margaret sighed, recognizing the determination in her friend's voice. When do you leave it tomorrow morning? So soon? Margaret's dismay was evident. Eleanor, please reconsider. At least wait until spring. Mountain winters are brutal, even for experienced homesteaders. Jackson says his house is built to withstand whatever the mountains bring. Eleanor managed a small smile. And I've never been afraid of hard work or harsh weather. It's not the weather I'm worried about, Margaret murmured. But she seemed to recognize the futility of further argument. Yes, Carl and I will look after your property, and I'll be praying every day for your safety and happiness, whatever form that may take. When they embraced at the door, Margaret held on longer than usual, as if trying to impart strength through the simple human contact. Promise you'll send word when you can, and if you ever need help for any reason. I know. Eleanor squeezed her friend's hands. Thank you. The journey back to her own property felt longer than the trip out, her mind heavy with Margaret's concerns and her own swirling emotions. She had packed methodically throughout the previous day, clothing, personal items, her mother's Bible, the few mementos from her life with Michael that still held meaning. The small collection of belongings, when gathered, seemed a paltry representation of nearly 30 years of life. But perhaps that was fitting for this new beginning, carrying only what was necessary, leaving space for whatever might come. As twilight descended, Eleanor found herself standing in the doorway of her bedroom, looking at the bed she'd shared with Michael. Their marriage had been comfortable, if not passionate, built on mutual respect and shared ambition rather than consuming love. Michael had been a gentle husband, considerate of her comfort and modesty. Their intimate encounters had been infrequent and brief, focused on the possibility of creating a child rather than pleasure for its own sake. Would Jackson expect more? The thought sent a shiver of apprehension, or was it anticipation, down her spine. His blunt talk of children implied physical intimacy, certainly, but the nature of that intimacy remained undefined. Eleanor closed the bedroom door, pushing such thoughts aside. Tomorrow would bring change enough without borrowing concerns from an uncertain future. True to his word, Jackson arrived with the wagon shortly after dawn. He worked silently, loading her trunks and boxes with efficient movements that made the heavy items seem weightless. Eleanor made a final circuit of the small house, checking that windows were secure and perishable foods properly stored or given away. In the barn, she spent a few moments with each of the remaining cattle, making soft promises that Margaret and Carl would care for them well. Jackson had arranged for most of the livestock to be purchased by neighboring ranchers' transactions that had yielded a surprising sum now secured in Eleanor's pocket. Ready? Jackson asked when she finally emerged from the barn, her eyes suspiciously bright. Eleanor nodded, not trusting her voice. This place had been her home for 5 years, the longest she'd lived anywhere since childhood. Leaving felt like abandoning a part of herself, even if that part had been struggling and lonely. The wagon was well-sprung and sturdy, built to navigate difficult terrain. Jackson had arranged a comfortable seat with blankets against the morning chill, and Eleanor noted with approval the supplies secured beneath oilcloth and the back provisions for the journey, and she assumed their shared future. As they pulled away from the property, Eleanor resisted the urge to look back. Forward was the only direction that mattered now. The journey to Pine Ridge would take most of the day, following roads that grew progressively rougher as they climbed into the mountains. Jackson handled the team with quiet confidence, occasionally pointing out landmarks or sharing brief observations about the surrounding countryside. Spring brings wildflowers to that meadow, he noted as they passed a snow-covered expanse. Purple and gold mostly. Good grazing for the horses. These small insights into his life in land came sparingly, each one a carefully offered piece of the puzzle that was Jackson Thornhill. Eleanor found herself collecting them, trying to assemble a clearer picture of the man she'd agreed to join. By midday, they'd climbed high enough that the air had thinned noticeably, each breath visible in the cold mountain sunshine. Jackson stopped to rest the horses near a stream partially frozen but still flowing beneath a layer of ice. "We'll reach the property before dark," he said, offering her a hand down from the wagon seat. Eleanor accepted his assistance, noting the careful way he gauged his strength, supporting without overwhelming. His hand was warm, despite the cold, the calluses speaking of years of physical labor. "How long have you lived here?" she asked, stretching legs stiff from hours of sitting. "3 years. Jackson checked the horses' harnesses, adjusting straps with practiced movements. "Started building the house the summer after Gettysburg finished it last year." "You built it yourself?" He nodded, something like pride briefly crossing his features. "Every beam and board. Took longer than I expected, but it's solid, built to last generations." The casual reference to future generations, their children and their children's children, hung in the crisp mountain air between them. Eleanor moved to the stream, breaking the thin ice to fill their water canteen. "You speak as if you're certain of the future." "Not certain." Jackson took the filled canteen from her, their fingers brushing briefly. "Hopeful. There's a difference." They continued their journey after a simple meal of bread, cheese, and dried apples. The road narrowed further, in some places little more than a track carved into the mountainside. Ancient pines towered above them, their branches heavy with snow that occasionally cascaded down when disturbed by a passing bird or squirrel. "There was a mining operation near here," Eleanor observed, noticing the remnants of equipment partially buried by snow and time. "Was that where Michael—" "No." Jackson's response was quick, almost sharp. "Your husband's accident was at the Blue Creek mine 15 miles south." The certainty with which he stated this caught Eleanor's attention. "You seem very familiar with the details." Jackson's hands tightened almost imperceptibly on the reins. "News travels even to those of us who live apart." Before she could pursue the subject further, he pointed ahead to where the track curved around a massive boulder. "We're here." As they rounded the bend, Eleanor's first glimpse of her new home took her breath away. The house stood in a natural clearing, backed by sheer cliffs that sheltered it from the worst mountain winds. Built of massive pine logs silvered by weather, it rose 2 full stories with a broad covered porch wrapping around 3 sides. Smoke curled from 2 stone chimneys, suggesting someone had prepared for their arrival. Outbuildings, a barn smokehouse, and what appeared to be a workshop formed a protective semicircle around a central yard. Beyond them, fenced pastures stretched toward a line of trees that marked the edge of a dense forest. It was not just a house, but a complete homestead, every element thoughtfully positioned and constructed with obvious care. Nothing like the ramshackle cabin Eleanor had half expected. "It's beautiful," she said, the words inadequate but sincere. "It's built to withstand whatever these mountains throw at it." Jackson echoed his earlier promise, but now she could see the truth of it in the sturdy construction and strategic positioning. The stream behind the house never freezes completely, even in the coldest winters. There's a spring cellar for food storage, and the barn's insulated better than most people's homes. As they approached, the front door opened to reveal a small, wiry man with weathered features and a shock of white hair. "Thomas," Jackson called in greeting. "Didn't expect you'd stay." The older man stepped onto the porch, arms folded against the cold. "Thought somebody ought to warm the place up. Wasn't sure your bride would appreciate arriving to cold hearths." Eleanor felt her cheeks warm at the term bride, though she'd made no such commitment yet. Jackson performed brief introductions as they unloaded the wagon. Thomas Blackburn, it seemed, was Jackson's nearest neighbor, though near was relative in these mountains, his own homestead being some 3 miles distant. "Known this giant since he first staked his claim," Thomas said, helping Eleanor down from the wagon with surprising strength for his age. "Watched him build this place beam by beam, stubborn as a mule about doing it right." There was obvious affection in the old man's gruff tone, and Eleanor found herself warming to him immediately. Here was someone who knew Jackson well, perhaps a source of insights into the man she'd agreed to join. "Mrs. Wright will be staying with me," Jackson said, the careful phrasing making their arrangement clear without details. "I appreciate you getting things ready." Thomas nodded, seemingly unsurprised by the situation. "Left stew simmering and bread cooling. Figured you'd both be hungry after the journey." He collected his coat and hat from inside. I'll leave you to get settled. Pleasant to meet you, Mrs. Wright. You need anything, my place is just over the eastern ridge. After Thomas departed, Eleanor found herself alone with Jackson in what was now at least temporarily their shared home. The interior was as impressive as the exterior, spacious rooms with polished wooden floors, walls adorned with simple but beautiful rustic furniture, clearly crafted by the same hands that had built the house. The main room centered around a massive stone fireplace, where a fire burned steadily, casting warm light over comfortable chairs and a solid oak table large enough to seat 8. Kitchen's through there. Jackson indicated a doorway from which savory aromas emanated. Bedrooms upstairs. 3 of them. He hesitated, then added, "You'll have your own room until you decide otherwise." The consideration was unexpected and touching. Eleanor had assumed their arrangement would immediately include shared sleeping quarters given his stated purpose for their partnership. "Thank you," she said softly. Jackson nodded once, then moved to bring in her trunks. "I'll show you around properly tomorrow. For now, you should rest and eat. The journey's tiring and the altitude takes some getting used to." He was right. Despite her best efforts to appear strong, Eleanor could feel exhaustion settling into her bones, not just from the physical journey, but from the emotional upheaval of the past 2 days. The warm, rich smell of Thomas's stew made her suddenly aware of how little she'd eaten. The kitchen proved to be as thoughtfully designed as the rest of the house, spacious with ample storage and high-quality cookware. A large wood stove, currently radiating pleasant heat, dominated one wall. Herbs hung drying from ceiling beams, and preserves lined shelves near a large pantry door. "This is impressive," Eleanor admitted, ladling stew into bowls Jackson provided. "A good kitchen matters." He set the table with simple but well-made pottery, especially through mountain winters. They ate in surprisingly comfortable silence, the rich stew venison with root vegetables and barley satisfying in a way Eleanor hadn't experienced in months. She found herself accepting a second helping without protest, earning a look of approval from Jackson. After the meal, he showed her to a bedroom at the top of a wide staircase. The room was spacious and airy, dominated by a large 4-poster bed covered with quilts in deep blues and greens. A dressing table stood near windows that would, she imagined, offer spectacular views when not obscured by darkness. "My room is at the end of the hall," Jackson said, setting her trunk at the foot of the bed. "The washroom is between. There's hot water if you'd like to bathe." The thought of a proper bath after the long, dusty journey was tempting beyond words. Eleanor nodded gratefully. "I'll bring up water," he said, turning to leave. At the door, he paused. "Eleanor." It was the first time he'd used her name since their agreement. The sound of it in his deep voice sent an unexpected shiver along her spine. "Yes. Welcome home." With those simple words, he left her to settle into what would be, for at least the next month, her new life. The bath, when prepared, proved to be another revelation. The washroom contained a large copper tub that somehow Jackson had filled with steaming water without her noticing his comings and goings. Herbs had been added to the water, lavender, and something else she couldn't identify, filling the room with soothing fragrance. Eleanor sank into the heat with a sigh that came from her very soul. When had she last indulged in such a luxury? Before Michael's death, certainly. Perhaps even before their marriage, when she'd still lived in her father's house with its strict economies and practical approaches to cleanliness. As she washed away the dust of travel and the last traces of her old life, Eleanor found her mind returning to the notebook Jackson had given her, to Michael's cryptic entry about borrowed money and secrets. Borrowed 1,000 from H. 6 months to repay. God help me if E ever finds out. Who was H, and why had Michael been so concerned about her discovering the loan? More troubling was the timing, the loan coming due just after Michael's death. Had this mysterious creditor ever come to collect? If so, why hadn't they approached her as Michael's widow and heir? These questions circled in her mind as she dressed for bed in a flannel nightgown that suddenly seemed too thin, too revealing for her new circumstances. She added a heavy shawl before venturing into the hallway to bid Jackson good night. His bedroom door stood partially open, lamplight spilling into the darkened corridor. Eleanor approached hesitantly, uncertain of the proper protocol in their unusual arrangement. "Jackson," she called softly. "Come in." She pushed the door wider to find him seated at a small desk, his massive frame making the sturdy furniture appear almost delicate. He was writing in a leather-bound journal, his handwriting surprisingly elegant, 4 hands so large. I wanted to thank you, Eleanor said, remaining in the doorway, for the bath and for giving me time to adjust. Jackson set down his pen, turning to face her. In the lamplight, the scar along his face was more prominent, a jagged line that spoke of violence and pain. A month, he said, his eyes holding hers. That was our agreement. You set the pace until then. The consideration in his words, the careful respect for boundaries she herself had established, touched something deep within her. This giant of a man who could easily have overpowered her or pressed his advantage was instead granting her complete control over the development of their relationship. Good night, then, she said, suddenly aware of her racing heart. Good night, Eleanor. She retreated to her room, closing the door firmly behind her. The bed, when she finally slipped beneath the quilts, was unexpectedly comfortable. The mattress neither too soft nor too firm, the linen smelling of sunshine and herbs. Despite her racing thoughts and the strangeness of her surroundings, exhaustion claimed her quickly. Her last conscious thought was of Jackson's hands, how they dwarfed the pen he'd been writing with, yet moved with such controlled precision. Hands that could break or build, hands that might someday soon know every inch of her body. The thought followed her into dreams both troubling and oddly comforting. Dawn painted the mountains gold and rose light filtering through curtains. Eleanor had been too tired to close the previous night. For a disorienting moment, she couldn't remember where she was. The room too large, the bed too comfortable, the silence too complete to be her familiar home. Then memory returned in a rush. Jackson Thornhill, the proposal, the journey, this house perched high among the pines built by a giant with patient hands and mysterious intentions. She rose quickly, dressing in one of her better dresses, dark blue wool, that Michael had always said brought out the color of her eyes. The thought of her late husband sent her reaching for the notebook she'd placed on the bedside table, but a noise from downstairs distracted her. The aroma of coffee and frying bacon drew her to the kitchen, where she found Jackson already dressed and cooking breakfast. He moved with surprising grace for a man his size, navigating the kitchen with obvious familiarity. Good morning, he said without turning. Sleep well. Better than I expected, Eleanor admitted, pouring herself coffee from the pot, keeping warm on the stove. You're up early. Habit. He transferred bacon to a waiting plate, then cracked eggs into the remaining fat. Always been up with the sun, more so since the war. It was the second reference he'd made to his military service, subtle but significant, offering another piece of the puzzle that was Jackson Thornhill. You mentioned your father died at Antietam, she said, carefully setting the table as he cooked. Were you there? Yes. The single word carried weight beyond its syllable. 6th Wisconsin Infantry, entered as a private, left as a sergeant. Left before the war ended. Jackson's shoulders tensed slightly. Medical discharge, spring of '63, after Chancellorsville. The Battle of Chancellorsville, Eleanor remembered reading about it in newspaper accounts. A Confederate victory, bloody and decisive. It explained something of the scar that marked his face, though she suspected the physical wound was matched by others less visible. I'm sorry, she said simply. He nodded acknowledgement, bringing their breakfast to the table. They ate in comfortable silence, the food simple but perfectly prepared. Through the kitchen window, Eleanor could see the day brightening, revealing snow-covered mountains and valleys stretching to the horizon. It's beautiful here, she said, genuinely impressed by the vista. That's why I chose it. Jackson followed her gaze. Reminded me of paintings I'd seen of the Scottish Highlands where my grandfather came from. He used to describe it to me when I was a boy. Said it was the kind of land that got into your blood, became part of you. It was the most he'd spoken at one time since their meeting, and Eleanor found herself hanging on each word. These glimpses into his past, offered sparingly, were like water in desert soil, precious and life-giving to her understanding of him. My father never spoke of his homeland that way, she said, offering a piece of herself in return. He left Boston with my mother when they were newly married. I think he always considered it a temporary exile, his mission work on the frontier. He returned east after she died. But you stayed. I was 17 by then, old enough to make my own choices. Eleanor's hands tightened around her coffee cup. And I'd met Michael. Jackson nodded understanding without pressing for details. After breakfast, I thought I'd show you the property, if you're feeling up to it. I'd like that. The tour revealed the full extent of Jackson's achievement. Beyond the main house and outbuildings she'd seen upon arrival, The property included a large vegetable garden, now dormant under snow, an orchard of young apple trees carefully wrapped against winter cold, and pastures that would come spring provide grazing for a substantial herd. The cattle are in the lower meadow for now, Jackson explained as they walked the perimeter of the nearest pasture, more sheltered from the wind. They'll move up here when the snow melts. Eleanor noted the sturdy fencing, the well-maintained paths, the general air of careful stewardship. Everything spoke of a man who took pride in his work and planned for the long term. "You've accomplished all this in 3 years," she asked, impressed despite herself. "Had a clear vision of what I wanted." Jackson's breath clouded in the cold air. "And no distractions." The woodland beyond the pastures proved to be equally well-managed trails, cleared deadfall, removed signs of sustainable harvesting for firewood and building materials. A stream, just as Jackson had promised, ran clear and cold even in winter, disappearing underground in places only to emerge again further down the slope. "The spring cellar is here," he indicated a small structure built into the hillside near the stream. "Keeps food cold in summer, prevents freezing in winter." The thoughtful planning extended to every aspect of the homestead. By the time they completed the tour, returning to the main house as the winter sun reached its zenith, Eleanor had developed a profound respect for what Jackson had created. "This is more than just a home," she said as they stamped snow from their boots on the porch. "It's a legacy." "That's the intention." Jackson held the door for her, his expression serious. "A place for generations, a foundation for family." The word hung between them, family. The purpose for their arrangement, the hope that had brought them together despite being virtual strangers. Inside, the house felt welcoming after the cold, the main room warmed by banked fires Jackson had maintained before their tour. Eleanor removed her coat and gloves, warming her hands by the hearth. "You need to rest," Jackson said, noting how she flexed her fingers. "The altitude takes time to adjust to." "I'm fine." But even as she said it, Eleanor felt the telltale lightheadedness that had been coming and going all morning. "Perhaps just for a little while." Jackson nodded, disappearing briefly into the kitchen. He returned with a steaming cup of tea. "Willow bark and mint helps with the headache I suspect you are not mentioning." Eleanor accepted the tea with surprise. "How did you know?" "My grandmother was half Cherokee, knew more about healing than any doctor I ever met." He added a log to the fire, stoking it carefully. "Taught me which plants help with different ailments." Another unexpected facet of this complex man. Eleanor sipped the tea, finding it bitter, but not unpleasant. "You should lie down," Jackson suggested. "I have work in the barn that needs attending. I'll be back to prepare dinner." Alone in the quiet house, Eleanor's exhaustion caught up with her. She settled onto a comfortable sofa near the fire, intending only to rest her eyes for a moment. She woke to twilight and the sound of quiet movement in the kitchen. The headache had subsided, leaving only a pleasant languor in its wake. For several minutes, she simply lay still, listening to Jackson move about, the domestic sounds oddly comforting. When she finally rose and made her way to the kitchen, she found him preparing a more elaborate meal than breakfast had been: venison, steaks, potatoes, and what appeared to be preserved vegetables from his pantry. "You should have woken me," she said, moving automatically to help. "You needed the rest." He handed her plates to set the table. "And I didn't mind cooking." They worked together with surprising ease, establishing a rhythm as if they'd shared kitchen duties for years rather than hours. By the time they sat down to eat, Eleanor felt more relaxed than she had since his appearance at her farm. "This is delicious," she said after the first few bites, genuinely impressed. "Thank you." Jackson seemed pleased by the compliment. Living alone, you either learn to cook well or resign yourself to poor meals. "Michael couldn't boil water without burning it," Eleanor said, the memory bringing a small smile. "He tried once for my birthday. Nearly set the curtains on fire." Jackson's answering smile transformed his face, softening the hard lines and making him appear younger, less burdened. "My first attempts weren't much better. Thomas, the neighbor you met, he taught me the basics. Said he couldn't stomach watching me ruin good venison one more time." The shared moment of levity eased something between them, making the evening meal less formal, more companionable. They spoke of small things: the property plans for the following day, observations about the weather, and its implications for the winter ahead. It was only as they cleared the dishes that Eleanor broached the subject that had been weighing on her mind. "Jackson, She began carefully stacking plates by the wash basin. "There's something I need to ask you." He paused in the act of storing leftover food, his attention immediately focused on her. "Ask. How well did you know Michael?" The question hung in the air between them, heavier than it should have been for such a simple inquiry. Jackson's expression remained neutral, but something flickered in his eyes, caution perhaps, or calculation. "We met a few times in town," he said after a moment. "Exchanged pleasantries. Nothing more." Eleanor studied his face, searching for signs of deception. "It's just, in his notebook, there's an entry about borrowing money. I wondered if you might know something about it." "Why would I?" His tone remained even, but his hands had stilled completely. "Because you found the notebook. Because you seemed to know details about his death that weren't widely shared. Because," she hesitated, then pressed on, "because there's something you're not telling me about why you chose me specifically." Jackson dried his hands slowly on a kitchen towel, his movements deliberate. When he spoke, his voice was quieter than usual. "Your husband and I weren't friends, Eleanor. But you're right that I knew of him beyond casual encounters in town." He met her gaze directly. "I was aware he'd taken on debt. I didn't know the specifics or the creditor's identity." "How were you aware? People talk, especially about men who suddenly have money to invest in mining equipment when their farms are struggling." The observation matched what Eleanor had found in the notebook records of purchases that had seemed questionable even at the time. But it didn't explain Jackson's interest in her after Michael's death. "That doesn't answer why you chose me, Wishong," she persisted. "Of all the women in the territory, why the widow of a man you barely knew?" Jackson was silent for a long moment, his expression unreadable. When he finally answered, his words were careful, measured. "I told you before I chose you because of your strength. Because I watched you fight to keep your home and your independence when most would have given up." He turned away, putting more distance between them. "The rest isn't relevant to our arrangement." "It is to me," Eleanor said firmly. "I've agreed to share my life with you, to potentially bear your children. I deserve honesty." The word hung between them like a challenge. Jackson's shoulders tensed, then relaxed on a heavy exhale. "You're right." He turned back to face her. "You deserve the truth, but I'm not sure you're ready to hear it." "Let me decide that." He studied her for a long moment, then nodded once. "Very well, but not tonight. Tomorrow, after you have had time to settle in more fully, I'll answer your questions then, all of them." It wasn't the immediate response Eleanor had hoped for, but the promise of full disclosure seemed sincere. She nodded her acceptance. "Tomorrow, then." The evening concluded with quiet activities by the fire, Jackson whittling what appeared to be a small animal figure from Pine Eleanor darning stockings that had needed attention for weeks. The domestic tableau might have been that of any long-married couple, comfortable in shared silence. But beneath the peaceful surface, questions continued to circle in Eleanor's mind. What connection existed between Jackson and Michael? What truth was he reluctant to share? And most troubling of all, would his answers change the tentative trust beginning to form between them? Tomorrow would bring revelations, for better or worse. Tonight she would prepare herself to face whatever truths awaited. As she climbed the stairs to her bedroom, Eleanor glanced back to find Jackson watching her, his expression a complex mixture of concern and something deeper, more primal. "Good night, Jackson." "Good night, Eleanor." He remained by the fire, the whittling knife idle in his hands. "Sleep well." In her room, Eleanor opened Michael's notebook again, searching for any clue she might have missed. Near the back on a page she hadn't examined closely before she found another cryptic entry: "Met with T at the Ridge. Discussed J in the arrangement. God forgive me for what I must do. TJ the arrangement." Thomas Jackson. What arrangement had Michael been referring to? The questions followed Eleanor into uneasy dreams where Michael's face morphed into Jackson's, both men keeping secrets just beyond her understanding. Morning arrived with fresh snow and frigid temperatures. Eleanor woke to find frost patterns on her window and extra quilts added to her bed sometime during the night. The thoughtful gesture was characteristic of what she was learning about Jackson, attentive to physical comfort, careful with boundaries. When she descended to the kitchen, she found it empty, but warm coffee already brewed and keeping hot on the stove. Through the window, she could see Jackson in the yard splitting wood with powerful, efficient strokes. His shirt clung to his broad shoulders despite the cold, suggesting he'd been at the task for some time. Eleanor poured herself coffee, watching him work. There was something mesmerizing about the rhythm of his movements, the controlled strength that made such difficult labor appear effortless. She was still watching when he finished gathering an armload of split logs before turning toward the house. Their eyes met through the window, and for a moment neither looked away. Something unspoken passed between them, acknowledgement perhaps of the conversations that lay ahead, and the truths that would be revealed. Jackson stomped snow from his boots before entering through the kitchen door, his cheeks ruddy from exertion and cold. "Morning," he said, depositing the wood in a box near the stove. "Sleep well." "Yes, thank you for the extra quilts." Eleanor handed him a cup of coffee, which he accepted with a grateful nod. "You've been up long." "Couple of hours." He removed his coat, hanging it on a peg by the door. "Wanted to get the wood split before the next storm hits. Looks like it'll be a heavy one." Eleanor glanced out the window at the clear blue sky. "How can you tell?" "The way the jays are behaving, the feel of the air." He joined her at the window, his large frame radiating warmth from his exertions. "See those clouds just appearing over the western ridge? They'll be here by nightfall, bringing at least a foot of new snow." His certainty was based on experience rather than guesswork, another reminder of how thoroughly he understood this mountain environment. They prepared breakfast together, falling into the same easy rhythm as the previous evening. It wasn't until they were seated at the table plates before them that Eleanor broached the subject they'd postponed. "You promised me answers today," she said quietly. Jackson set down his fork, his expression growing serious. "I did. I found another entry in Michael's notebook last night. It mentioned meeting with T at the Ridge and discussing J and some arrangement." She watched his face carefully. "Was T Thomas Blackburn? Were you J?" A muscle twitched in Jackson's jaw, the first sign of tension she'd seen in his otherwise controlled demeanor. "Yes to both questions." "What was the arrangement, Jackson?" He was silent for a long moment, seemingly weighing his words. When he finally spoke, his voice was lower than usual, almost gentle. "Your husband was in trouble, Eleanor. Serious trouble. The money he borrowed, it wasn't from a bank or legitimate lender. It was from a man named Victor Hargrove, a dangerous man who doesn't forgive debts." The name meant nothing to Eleanor, but the gravity with which Jackson spoke, it sent a chill through her. "Michael came to me because he'd heard I had experience dealing with men like Hargrove during the war." Jackson continued, his eyes never leaving hers. "He was desperate, afraid for himself. And for you." "Why didn't he tell me?" The question emerged as barely more than a whisper. "He wanted to protect you. He believed he could repay the debt before you ever needed to know about it." A shadow crossed Jackson's face, but the mind collapse changed everything. Eleanor's mind raced, connecting fragments of information into a troubling whole. "You're saying Michael's death wasn't an accident?" "I'm saying I don't know for certain that it was." Jackson's careful phrasing suggested he'd given the matter considerable thought. "What I do know is that Hargrove's men were seen near the mine in the days before the collapse. And I know that Michael had started asking questions about Hargrove's business practices, questions that could have caused problems for a man with much to hide." The implications were staggering. Eleanor set down her cup with trembling fingers. "Why didn't you go to the sheriff? To the territorial authorities? With what evidence, rumors, and coincidences?" Jackson shook his head. "Hargrove has powerful friends, including Judge Thompson in Silver Creek. Any accusation would have been dismissed without proof." Judge Thompson, Margaret's brother-in-law. The connection to her friend's family added another layer of complexity to the situation. "The same." Jackson's expression was grim. "The judge has been helping Hargrove acquire properties throughout the territory, some through legitimate means, others through less savory methods." Eleanor struggled to process this new information. Michael's hidden debt, his mysterious death connections to powerful figures in the community, it painted a picture far darker than she'd imagined. "What was your arrangement with Michael?" she asked, returning to her original question. Jackson hesitated, then answered with direct simplicity. "If anything happened to him, I promised to look out for you, to make sure you were safe from Hargrove and his men." The confession hung in the air between them, its implications slowly unfolding in Eleanor's mind. "So your proposal, your interest in me, it was because of a promise to my dead husband." The thought brought a surprising wave of disappointment. "It started that way," Jackson admitted. "I agreed to keep an eye on you to make sure you weren't harassed or threatened. But the watching became more. More? I found myself admiring your strength, your determination, the way you faced each day's challenges without surrendering. His voice grew softer, almost reverent. It wasn't duty that brought me to your door during the blizzard, Eleanor. It was something I hadn't felt in a very long time. The confession, unexpected and unadorned, silenced any response she might have made. I should have told you from the beginning, he continued, but I feared you wouldn't believe my intentions were honorable if you knew about my promise to Michael. Were they? The question slipped out before she could reconsider. Honorable. Jackson met her gaze without flinching. Yes. Whatever else you may think of me, know that I have never lied about my hopes for our future together. I want a partnership, a family, a life built on mutual respect and eventually affection. The sincerity in his voice was unmistakable, but the revelations had left Eleanor reeling. She rose from the table, needing space to think. I need time to process this. She moved toward the door, reaching for her coat. Eleanor. Jackson remained seated, making no move to stop her. There's one more thing you should know. She paused, hand on the doorknob. Hargrove never collected on Michael's debt, which means it's still outstanding. His voice was grave. And now that you've remarried or appear to have you present a new opportunity for him to claim what he believes he's owed. The implication was clear. Her arrangement with Jackson had not only failed to protect her from Michael's creditor, but might have actually made her a more tempting target. How long do we have? She asked, practical concerns momentarily overriding emotional turmoil. It's been 18 months since Michael's death. Hargrove is patient, but not indefinitely. Jackson's hands rested flat on the table, steady and controlled. When he learns of our situation, and he'll come with documentation showing Michael's debt, now inflated with interest. He'll claim legal right to this property as payment. Can he do that? Not legitimately, but with Judge Thompson's support, he can create enough legal complications to make fighting him difficult. Jackson's expression hardened. I won't let that happen, Eleanor. Whatever else comes of our arrangement, I promise you, this Hargrove will not take what we've built. The fierce protectiveness in his voice should have been reassuring. Instead, it underscored how little control Eleanor had over her own fate, first as Michael's widow, now as Jackson's almost wife. I need to be alone, she said, pulling on her coat. I'm going for a walk. The storm isn't here yet. She wrapped a scarf around her neck, avoiding his concerned gaze. I won't go far. Jackson nodded reluctantly. Follow the path to the stream and back. It's marked with stones. Don't go beyond the edge of the clearing. The crisp mountain air cleared Eleanor's head as she trudged through snow already deep from previous storms. The path Jackson had indicated was indeed clearly marked, making navigation simple despite her unfamiliarity with the property. As she walked, her thoughts circled endlessly around the morning's revelations. Jackson had initially approached her out of obligation to Michael, a fact that stung more than it should have given their practical arrangement. But he'd spoken of developing genuine admiration, perhaps even deeper feelings. Was that truth or merely what he thought she needed to hear? And what of Hargrove, this mysterious creditor who might have been involved in Michael's death? If Jackson's suspicions were correct, Eleanor had been living under threat without realizing it and might still be in danger. The stream, when she reached it, burbled beneath a thin layer of ice, the sound soothing despite her troubled thoughts. Eleanor seated herself on a snow-covered rock, watching water bubble up through cracks in the frozen surface. Like truth, she thought, always finding a way to emerge no matter how we try to contain it. How much of her life had been built on half-truths and omissions, Michael hiding his debts and dealings, Jackson concealing his connection to her late husband, even her father returning east without her. After her mother's death, his letters full of details about his new parish, but never mentioning the woman who had replaced her mother in his home and heart. The realization brought unexpected clarity. She was tired of others deciding what truth she could handle, what realities she should be protected from. If she was to build a life with Jackson, however temporary or permanent that might prove it would be, with open eyes and complete honesty between them. The decision made, Eleanor rose to return to the house. As she turned, movement at the edge of the trees caught her attention, a flash of something too large to be a deer, too deliberate to be windblown brush. Hello, she called, suddenly aware of how isolated she was, how vulnerable despite being on Jackson's property. No response came, but the sense of being watched intensified. Eleanor quickened her pace, following the stone-marked path back toward the house. Twice more she caught glimpses of movement among the trees, each occurrence sending her heart racing faster. By the time the house came into view, she was nearly running, breath-forming clouds in the frigid air. Jackson must have been watching for her return, for he emerged onto the porch before she reached it, his expression shifting from concern to alarm as he read her face. What happened? He descended the steps in 2 strides, reaching her side with surprising speed for such a large man. "Someone's out there," Eleanor managed between breaths, "in the trees near the stream, watching." Jackson's hand moved instinctively to his belt, where she noticed for the first time he wore a holstered revolver. "Get inside," he said quietly. "Lock the door behind you." "Jackson." "Now, Eleanor." His tone brooked no argument. "I'll be right back." She did as instructed, watching anxiously from the window as Jackson moved toward the tree line with the fluid grace of a man accustomed to danger. His hand remained near his weapon, but he didn't draw it a restraint that spoke of experience rather than hesitation. From her vantage point, Eleanor could see little of what transpired once Jackson reached the edge of the clearing. He disappeared among the pines, his dark coat blending with shadows beneath the evergreen boughs. Minutes stretched endlessly. Eleanor paced from window to window, searching for any sign of his return. The clouds Jackson had predicted were indeed gathering on the western horizon, their dark mass promising the storm he had forecast. When he finally emerged from the trees, his expression was grim but controlled. Eleanor unlocked the door before he reached the porch, anxiety overriding caution. "Well," she asked as he stomped snow from his boots. "Tracks," Jackson said tersely, removing his coat. "2 men watching the house. They left when they saw you heading back." "Hargrove's men." "Most likely." He hung his coat by the door, his movements deliberate despite obvious tension. "Checking on rumors about your new living arrangements." Eleanor felt a chill that had nothing to do with the winter air. "How did they find us so quickly? We've barely been here a day." "News travels fast in small communities." "Someone in town probably mentioned you were seen leaving with me yesterday." Jackson moved to the fireplace, adding logs to the banked flames. It was only a matter of time. The casual acknowledgement that he'd expected surveillance, perhaps even planned for it, added another layer to Eleanor's understanding of their situation. This wasn't just about a promise to Michael or Jackson's personal interest in her. There were larger forces at play, dangerous ones. "What happens now?" she asked, joining him by the fire. Jackson straightened to his full height, his expression resolute. "Now we prepare. Hargrove will make his move soon, within days if I judge correctly. He'll come with documentation of Michael's debt and legal papers claiming right to this property. Can we fight him? We can and will." Jackson's eyes met hers, and in them, she saw not just determination, but something fiercer, more personal. "But I need to know if you're still committed to our arrangement, Eleanor, especially now that you know the truth about how it began." The question struck at the heart of her earlier doubts. Was she willing to continue this partnership, knowing it had originated from obligation rather than choice? Could she build a future, perhaps even a family, with a man whose interest had begun as a promise to her dead husband? But those doubts were based on a partial understanding. Now, seeing the risks Jackson had taken and would continue to take on her behalf, the picture was more complex. "I'm committed," she said finally. "Whatever brought us together initially, we're partners now. In this fight and whatever comes after." Relief flickered across Jackson's features, quickly replaced by renewed resolve. "Then we have preparations to make. The storm will buy us time. Hargrove won't send his men up the mountain in a blizzard. But once the weather clears, we need to be ready." As if punctuating his words, wind gusted against the windows, carrying the first flakes of the approaching snowstorm. Eleanor thought of the tracks Jackson had found of unseen watchers in the trees of a debt collector who might have had a hand in her husband's death. She had left her home seeking security and the possibility of a new beginning. Instead, she had walked into danger that had been shadowing her all along. But this time, she wasn't facing it alone. This time, she had Jackson Thornhill, a giant of a man with secrets of his own, but also with the strength and determination to stand against whatever threat approached. As the storm descended upon the mountain, Eleanor and Jackson began their preparations for a confrontation that would determine not just their future together, but perhaps their very survival. The storm arrived with primal fury, transforming the mountain into a howling wilderness of wind and snow. By nightfall, drifts had risen halfway up the first-floor windows, sealing Eleanor and Jackson within the sturdy walls of the homestead as effectively as any fortress. Inside, they worked with quiet efficiency, Jackson checking weapons and reinforcing doors, Eleanor taking inventory of supplies and preparing food that could be eaten cold if necessary. Neither spoke of the danger waiting beyond the storm, but awareness of it hung in the air between them, lending urgency to their preparations. "The root cellar is well stocked," Eleanor reported, returning from her inspection. "Enough preserved food to last months if needed." Jackson nodded, not looking up from the rifle he was cleaning. "The barn's secure, animals fed. We could be snowed in for a week and manage just fine." It was strange how quickly they'd fallen into partnership, dividing tasks based on practical necessity rather than traditional roles. Jackson had shown no surprise when Eleanor had examined his shotgun, with knowledgeable hands checking the firing mechanism with practiced ease. "My father believed every frontier woman should know how to defend herself," she'd explained, catching his raised eyebrow. "He taught me to shoot when I was 12. Now, as evening settled over the snowbound homestead, they retreated to the main room, where fires burned in the massive stone hearth. Outside, the wind's voice rose and fell, sometimes screaming, sometimes whispering a wild chorus, accompanying their quiet preparations. "Tell me about Hargrove," Eleanor said, breaking the companionable silence. "If we're to face him, I should understand who he is." Jackson's hands stilled on the gun oilcloth. For a moment, she thought he might deflect the question. Instead, he set aside the weapon and turned to face her fully. "Victor Hargrove came west after the war," he began, his deep voice pitched low against the storm's backdrop. "Made his fortune in mining investments and land speculation. But the legitimate businesses are just a facade. For what? Loan sharking, extortion, taking advantage of desperate people, then claiming their property when they can't pay." Jackson's expression darkened. "And eliminating anyone who threatens his operations. Like Michael." The words emerged barely above a whisper. "Perhaps." Jackson's caution was evident. "I have suspicions, not proof. But the timing of your husband's accident, coming just weeks before his loan payment was due, it raises questions." Eleanor wrapped her arms around herself, chilled despite the fire's warmth. "And now he'll come for this property." "Not just the property." Jackson's gaze was steady, unflinching. "Hargrove's method is to target those who've recently remarried. He approaches the widow or widower with documentation of debt, then claims rights to any property held by the new couple. It's a calculated strategy, using legitimate-seeming legal means to take what isn't his." The implications settled over Eleanor like a physical weight. "So our arrangement makes us a perfect target, yes." Jackson's massive hands curled into fists, then deliberately relaxed. "But it also gives us an advantage he doesn't expect." "What advantage?" "We're prepared." Jackson rose, moving to stand before the fire. Flames illuminated his scarred profile, casting dramatic shadows across features that seemed carved from unyielding stone. "And I've faced worse enemies than Victor Hargrove." There was something in his tone, a quiet certainty that spoke of experiences beyond her knowledge. Eleanor studied him, this giant of a man who had entered her life so abruptly, bringing both danger and protection in equal measure. During the war, she asked, following an instinct that there was more to his military service than he'd revealed. Jackson remained silent for so long that Eleanor thought he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of memories long suppressed. "After Chancellorsville, I was assigned to a special unit, men chosen for particular skills." He turned from the fire to face her, his expression grave. "We operated behind enemy lines, gathering intelligence, disrupting supply chains, eliminating specific threats." Eliminating. The euphemism wasn't lost on Eleanor. War requires actions that peace cannot judge. His words were measured, neither apologetic nor proud. "I did what was necessary, what I was ordered to do. When the physical wounds healed enough for field duty, they sent me back because I was effective at my assignments." The revelation explained much about Jackson, his watchfulness, his comfort with weapons, the controlled way he moved through the world. Eleanor had known he was a veteran, but now understood he'd been something more specialized, more dangerous. "Is that how you got the scar?" The question slipped out before she could reconsider its propriety. Jackson's hand rose to his face, fingers tracing the jagged line that ran from temple to jaw. Confederate cavalry patrol. I was careless. Let them get too close. Something like grim humor flickered in his eyes. Learned an important lesson about vigilance that day. The confession, for that's what it felt like, created a new intimacy between them. Jackson had shared not just facts, but a glimpse into the experiences that had shaped him, the burdens he carried beneath his controlled exterior. Eleanor found herself wanting to offer something equally meaningful in return. I'm afraid of childbirth, she said quietly. That's why Michael and I never had children despite trying. The fear, it does something to a woman's body, makes conception difficult. Jackson turned toward her, surprise evident in his expression. My mother died bringing my brother into the world. Eleanor continued, the words coming easier now that she'd begun. He didn't survive either. I was 12, old enough to understand everything that happened. The screaming, the blood, the terrible silence afterward. Eleanor, you should know this, she interrupted gently. Your proposal included children. If I can't give them to you, whether from fear or some physical limitation, you deserve to understand why. Jackson moved to sit beside her, close but not touching, his presence solid and unexpectedly comforting. Fear is natural, he said after a moment. It keeps us alive in dangerous situations, but it doesn't have to rule us. Some fears run too deep to overcome. Perhaps, his voice was thoughtful rather than dismissive, or perhaps they just need to be faced with the right support, the right preparation. The practical approach, addressing fear as a problem to be solved rather than a weakness to be ashamed of, was surprisingly reassuring. There was no judgment in Jackson's tone, no disappointment at her revelation. If children come, they come, he continued. If not, we'll face that reality together. But I won't have you carrying this fear alone, Eleanor. Not anymore. The simple promise to share her burden, rather than demand she overcome it, touched Eleanor deeply. In that moment, looking at this scarred warrior with his matter-of-fact compassion, she felt something shift within her. Not a magical dissolution of lifelong fear, but the first fragile tendril of trust taking root. Thank you, she said simply. Jackson nodded understanding in his pale eyes. Outside, the storm continued its assault, but within the sturdy walls of their shared home, something new was building, an alliance deeper than convenience, stronger than their original arrangement had envisioned. Later, as they prepared for bed, Eleanor found herself lingering in the kitchen doorway, watching Jackson bank the main fire for the night. His movements were methodical, practiced, a man accustomed to preparing for whatever morning might bring. We should reach out to Margaret Thompson when the weather clears, she said, the thought occurring as she watched him work. She might have information about her brother-in-law's connection to Hargrove. Jackson straightened, considering her suggestion. It's risky. If Judge Thompson learns we're asking questions. Margaret can be trusted, Eleanor insisted, and she has access to conversations and social gatherings we don't. She might hear things valuable to our situation. After a moment, Jackson nodded. You're right. We need allies, and information is our best weapon right now. He glanced toward the window where snow continued to accumulate against the glass. When the pass clears, I'll ride to the Thompson farm. We'll ride together, Eleanor corrected. Margaret is more likely to speak freely with me present. Jackson's eyebrows rose slightly, but he didn't argue. Together then, if the weather permits, within the next few days. As Eleanor climbed the stairs to her bedroom, she realized how quickly she'd begun thinking in terms of we and our, a partnership forming naturally despite the unusual circumstances of their arrangement. She wasn't naive enough to mistake practicality for deeper attachment, but she couldn't deny the comfort found in shared purpose and mutual respect. Her room, when she entered it, felt colder than the previous night, despite the well-banked fire in the small hearth. Eleanor added another log, watching flames catch and grow before preparing for bed. As she slipped beneath heavy quilts, her thoughts returned to Jackson's revelation about his wartime activities. She tried to imagine this quiet, controlled man in the chaos of battle, moving behind enemy lines with lethal purpose. The image should have been frightening, but instead brought a strange reassurance. Whatever threats Hargrove presented, Jackson had faced worse and survived. Sleep came eventually, accompanied by dreams of snow and fire, of wolves with yellow eyes that turned into watching men among the trees. Throughout the restless night, the storm's voice provided constant accompaniment, sometimes raging, sometimes crooning, but never fully silent. Morning arrived with blinding brightness. The storm had passed during the night, leaving behind a transformed landscape of pristine white, sculpted by wind into fantastic shapes. Sunlight reflected off the snow, with diamond brilliance forcing Eleanor to shield her eyes as she looked out her bedroom window. The temperature had dropped significantly, evident in the frost patterns etched across the glass and the plumes of smoke rising straight up from the chimney undisturbed by even the slightest breeze. Such stillness often followed major storms, Jackson had explained the previous evening. The calm might last hours or days before weather patterns shifted again. Dressing quickly in her warmest clothes, Eleanor descended to find Jackson already returned from tending the animals, snow crusting his coat and hat. "How bad is it?" she asked, pouring coffee for them both. 4 feet on the level ground, deeper in drifts. He removed his outdoor gear, hanging it near the fire to dry. "The barn path is clear enough for the livestock, but the main road won't be passable for at least 2 days, maybe 3. The news brought mixed emotions, relief at the temporary reprieve from Hargrove's threatened appearance, frustration at being unable to seek Margaret's assistance. "We'll use the time to prepare," Jackson said, seeming to read her thoughts. "There's much you should know about the property, hiding places, escape routes if things go badly." The practical approach to potential danger was characteristic of him, Eleanor had noticed. No false reassurances, no attempt to shield her from harsh realities, just clear-eyed assessment and pragmatic planning. After breakfast, Jackson led her on a different kind of tour than their first day's exploration. This time he showed her concealed storage spaces beneath floorboards, a hidden root cellar, accessible from both house and barn, and a carefully maintained trail that led through dense forest to a small cabin half a mile distant. "Thomas built it years ago as a hunting lodge," Jackson explained, as they surveyed the simple one-room structure. "Hardly uses it now, but it's stocked with enough supplies to sustain someone for several days if necessary." "You've been preparing for trouble for some time," Eleanor observed, noting the carefully stacked firewood and preserved food. Jackson nodded, his expression grim. "Since Michael first came to me about Hargrove, I had a feeling the situation wouldn't end cleanly no matter what happened." The thoroughness of his preparations was both reassuring and sobering. This wasn't a man given to paranoia or excessive caution. His military background would have taught him realistic threat assessment. If Jackson believed such extensive preparations necessary, the danger from Hargrove was significant indeed. They returned to the main house as afternoon shadows began to lengthen, the temperature dropping further with the fading light. Inside, Eleanor busied herself preparing a hearty stew, while Jackson brought in additional firewood, both of them moving with the comfortable synchronization of people growing accustomed to shared space and task. "There's something I've been wondering," Eleanor said as they sat down to eat. "Why didn't Hargrove come after my property after Michael died, if the debt was still outstanding?" Jackson considered the question, his expression thoughtful. "Several possibilities. Your property alone might not have been valuable enough to justify the effort. Or perhaps he was waiting for you to remarry, knowing he could claim more that way. Or he thought I might lead him to something else Michael left behind," Eleanor suggested, the idea forming as she spoke. "Something more valuable than my small homestead." Jackson's eyes sharpened with interest. "What makes you say that?" Eleanor retrieved Michael's notebook from where she'd left it on a side table. These entries about the loan, they're followed by notes about a new mining claim Michael had staked. He was excited about it, called it a game changer for our future. Jackson took the notebook, examining the pages she indicated. "Did he ever show you this claim, tell you where it was located?" "No." The realization brought a wave of fresh grief and frustration. "Michael kept many things to himself, thinking he was protecting me. But he must have told someone. The claim would have been registered officially." "Not necessarily." Jackson handed the notebook back, his expression troubled. "During the war and after, many prospectors kept their claims secret until they could verify their value. They'd file misleading paperwork, use coded language in their records. You think that's what Michael did? It would explain Hargrove's interest in you specifically, rather than just your property. He may believe you know where this claim is located or have documentation that would lead to it." The theory made disturbing sense. If Michael had discovered something valuable enough to consider it life-changing, it might also have been valuable enough for someone like Hargrove to kill for, especially if Michael had used Hargrove's money to develop the claim initially. "I need to go through Michael's things again," Eleanor said, rising from the table. There might be something I missed, some clue he left behind. She retrieved the small trunk she'd brought from her homestead, the one containing Michael's personal effects that she'd kept after his death. Together, she and Jackson spread the contents across the main room floor. Clothing letters, a pocket watch that no longer worked, a small Bible, various papers related to their farm. Nothing immediately suggested a hidden mining claim or secret wealth. But as Eleanor carefully examined each item, she noticed something odd about the Bible, its binding slightly thicker than seemed necessary for the number of pages. Jackson, she called, holding the book toward the light. Look at this. His large hands took the Bible carefully, thick fingers probing the leather binding with surprising delicacy. There's something inside the cover. Using a small knife, Jackson carefully cut along one edge of the binding, revealing a folded piece of paper concealed within the leather. He extracted it, gently unfolding what proved to be a hand-drawn map. Eleanor leaned close, their heads nearly touching, as they examined the crude but detailed drawing. It showed a section of mountain terrain with a creek, distinctive rock formations, and an X marked near what appeared to be a cliff face. Notations in Michael's handwriting indicated compass directions and approximate distances. This could be anywhere in these mountains, Eleanor said, disappointment evident in her voice. But Jackson was studying the map with intense concentration, his finger tracing certain features. Not anywhere, he murmured. These formations, I've seen them. They're on the north side of Blackwater Ridge, maybe 10 miles from here. Hope flared in Eleanor's chest. You're certain? Reasonably so. Jackson's expression remained cautious. But even if this is the claim location, we can't reach it now. The ridge would be impassable after yesterday's storm. But when the snow melts? When spring comes, we can investigate, he agreed. But for now, our priority has to be preparing for Hargrove. This map confirms he has reason beyond simple debt collection to pursue us aggressively. Eleanor folded the map carefully, her mind racing with implications. If Michael had indeed discovered a valuable ore deposit, it might explain both his secretive behavior before his death and Hargrove's continued interest afterward. But it also raised the stakes of their confrontations significantly. We should hide this somewhere secure, she said, holding the map between trembling fingers. If Hargrove's men search the house, they won't find it. Jackson took the map, moving to a seemingly solid section of wall near the fireplace. With practiced movements, he released a hidden catch, revealing a small compartment built into the thick logs. No one knows about this, except me and now you. The discovery of the map altered something between them, adding urgency to their alliance, but also a deeper layer of trust. Jackson had shared his most secure hiding place without hesitation, incorporating Eleanor fully into his defensive preparations. That night, they sat before the fire later than usual, discussing strategies and contingencies. The comfortable silence of previous evenings had been replaced by purposeful conversation, each contributing ideas based on their different perspectives and experiences. If Hargrove comes with legal documents, we'll need witnesses to any confrontation, Eleanor pointed out. People who can testify to his methods and threats if necessary. Jackson nodded approval. Thomas Blackburn would stand with us, and if we can reach the Thompsons, Carl's word carries weight in the community. We need evidence of Michael's death being suspicious. Eleanor continued the strategy, forming as she spoke. Someone who saw Hargrove's men near the mine before the collapse. That would be difficult to prove after so much time. Jackson's practical assessment wasn't discouraging, merely realistic. But there might be other approaches. Hargrove keeps records of his transactions, legitimate and otherwise. If we could access those... The planning continued until the fire burned low and exhaustion began to claim them both. As they prepared to retire for the night, Eleanor found herself reluctant to retreat to her separate bedroom to face her churning thoughts alone. Jackson, she said as he banked the fire for the night, thank you for sharing this burden with me, for not protecting me from the truth. He straightened, turning to face her with an expression that combined weariness and something warmer, more personal. You're stronger than Michael knew, he said simply. Stronger than perhaps you know yourself. The quiet affirmation touched something deep within Eleanor, a recognition she hadn't realized she'd been seeking. Not empty flattery or patronizing reassurance, but acknowledgement of a strength she'd discovered through necessity and hardship. Good night, Jackson. Good night, Eleanor. He remained by the fire watching as she climbed the stairs to her room. Only when she reached the top did he move away, his own preparations for sleep audible in the quiet house. Alone in her bedroom, Eleanor found herself listening for his movements, taking comfort in the knowledge of his presence below. Whatever dangers awaited them, whatever complications arose from Michael's hidden claim, she would not face them alone. The realization brought an unexpected peace, allowing her to slip into dreamless sleep despite the uncertainties that surrounded them. 3 days passed before the mountain roads became passable. 3 days of continued preparations, strategy discussions, and growing awareness of each other's habits and preferences. They worked together with increasing ease, anticipating needs and adjusting to each other's rhythms without conscious effort. On the morning of the fourth day, with sunshine strengthening and snow beginning to melt from south-facing slopes, Jackson declared the path to Silver Creek navigable. "We should visit the Thompsons today," he said over breakfast. "The road will be difficult, but manageable if we leave soon." Eleanor agreed, eager to speak with Margaret and gather whatever information her friend might have about Judge Thompson's connection to Hargrove. She dressed in her warmest clothes, preparing for a long, cold ride through snow-covered terrain. The journey proved more challenging than anticipated. Though Jackson had cleared the immediate path from their property, the main road remained deeply drifted in places, forcing them to dismount and lead the horses through particularly troublesome sections. "The valley will be clearer," Jackson assured her as they navigated a difficult passage. "Snow doesn't accumulate as deeply there." He was right. As they descended from the mountain heights, the snow thinned noticeably, and by the time they reached the rolling countryside surrounding Silver Creek, they were able to make better progress. The Thompson farm came into view around midday, a prosperous-looking property with well-maintained buildings and extensive pasture land. Smoke rose from the main house chimney, and figures moved about the yard, engaged in post-storm repairs. Carl Thompson spotted them, first raising a hand in greeting as they approached. A sturdy man in his 50s with iron-gray hair and a weathered face, he exuded the practical competence of his successful farmer. "Mrs. Wright," he called, setting aside the fence post he'd been examining. "And Mr. Thornhill, unexpected pleasure." Eleanor dismounted, accepting Carl's assistance with a grateful smile. "We hope to speak with you and Margaret if you have time." "Always time for neighbors." Carl's gaze moved between them, curiosity evident, but restrained by a frontier courtesy that discouraged direct questions about others' arrangements. "Margaret's inside. She'll be pleased to see you." Margaret's reaction to their arrival was exactly as Eleanor had predicted: initial surprise, followed by genuine welcome tinged with concern. "Eleanor." She embraced her friend warmly before stepping back to include Jackson in her greeting with a respectful nod. "Mr. Thornhill, come in, both of you. You must be frozen after that ride." The Thompson kitchen was warm and inviting, filled with the aroma of baking bread and the comfortable clutter of a well-used family space. Margaret bustled about preparing coffee and setting out freshly baked rolls, while Carl and Jackson discussed road conditions and weather prospects. Only when they were all seated around the kitchen table, steaming cups before them, did Margaret address the question clearly burning in her mind. "I've been worried about you, Eleanor, after you left so suddenly." She glanced at Jackson, measuring her words. "Your arrangement seemed hasty." "It was necessary," Eleanor replied simply, "and has proven beneficial in ways I hadn't anticipated." The careful phrasing seemed to reassure Margaret somewhat, though her expression remained watchful as she observed the subtle interactions between Eleanor and Jackson. "We need your help, Margaret," Eleanor continued, moving to the purpose of their visit. "Or more precisely, your information." Margaret's eyebrows rose. "What kind of information?" Eleanor glanced at Jackson, who nodded slightly, permission to proceed as they discussed. "About your brother-in-law, Judge Thompson," Eleanor said carefully, "and his connection to a man named Victor Hargrove." The reaction was immediate and revealing. Margaret's face paled while Carl's expression hardened into something like anger. "Why are you asking about Hargrove?" Carl demanded, his normally genial tone sharpened by obvious concern. Jackson leaned forward, his massive frame dominating the table despite his relaxed posture. "Because he's about to make a move against us, using Michael Wright's alleged debt as justification." The blunt statement hung in the air between them. Margaret looked to Eleanor for confirmation, receiving a grim nod in response. "We believe Michael borrowed money from Hargrove before his death," Eleanor explained. "Money that was never repaid. Now that I appear to have remarried, she gestured toward Jackson, acknowledging their arrangement without defining it precisely. Hargrove will likely claim rights to our combined property as payment. With your brother-in-law's legal support, Jackson added, addressing Carl directly. Carl's weathered face showed conflicting emotions, concerned resignation, and something like guilt. Robert's involvement with Hargrove isn't something we discuss openly, he said finally. Family loyalty demands some discretion. Family loyalty shouldn't extend to supporting theft and possibly murder. Jackson countered, his voice remaining even despite the harshness of his words. Murder, Margaret whispered, looking stricken. What are you saying? Eleanor reached for her friend's hand. We have reason to believe Michael's death wasn't an accident, that Hargrove may have arranged the mine collapse when Michael couldn't pay his debt. The accusation brought stunned silence to the warm kitchen. Carl and Margaret exchanged glances, heavy with unspoken communication. We've heard rumors, Carl admitted after a long moment, about other accidents befalling Hargrove's debtors. Nothing that would stand up in court, you understand, just whispers. Robert would never knowingly participate in murder. Margaret insisted, loyalty to her husband's brother evident despite her obvious distress. He's too committed to the law, whatever his other faults. But he has helped Hargrove claim properties through legal means, Jackson pressed, using debt documentation to force transfers of ownership. Carl nodded reluctantly. Robert believes he's simply enforcing legitimate contracts. Hargrove presents the paperwork, witnesses confirm signatures, the judge rules accordingly. His expression suggested he found the practice distasteful but technically legal. I've tried to discuss my concerns with him, but Robert can be rigid in his interpretations. We need to know what to expect, Eleanor said, returning to their primary purpose. When Hargrove comes with his claims about Michael's debt, what legal maneuvers will he employ? How can we counter them effectively? Margaret seemed uncertain, but Carl leaned forward with newfound resolve. Robert follows patterns in these cases. He'll require documented proof of the debt, which Hargrove will certainly have, legitimate or otherwise. He'll ask for witnesses to the original agreement, which Hargrove will provide. And he'll determine the current value of properties involved to ensure the settlement is equitable. Is there any way to challenge the debt's validity? Jackson asked. Proof of forgery would do it, Carl replied, or evidence that the loan was already repaid. Without either, he spread his hands in a gesture of helplessness. Eleanor and Jackson exchanged glances, silently acknowledging the difficulty of their position. Michael's debt might well have been legitimate, even if Hargrove's methods were not. There's something else you should know, Margaret said hesitantly. Something I overheard at Robert's house last month during a dinner party. All attention focused on her as she continued, her voice lowered, despite there being no one to overhear them. Hargrove was there. He and Robert often socialized now. They were in Robert's study, but the door wasn't fully closed. I heard Hargrove mention Wright's widow and something about a claim worth 10 times the debt. Eleanor's pulse quickened. Did they specify what kind of claim? Margaret shook her head. They noticed me in the hallway before I could hear more, but Hargrove seemed eager, almost excited. Whatever he believes you have, Eleanor, it's valuable enough to pursue aggressively. The confirmation of their theory about Michael's hidden mining claim brought both validation and increased concern. If Hargrove coveted the claim enough to orchestrate Michael's death, he wouldn't hesitate to take similar action against anyone else who stood in his way. Is there anyone else who might have information? Jackson asked. Someone who worked at the mine, perhaps who saw something suspicious before the collapse? Carl considered the question, then nodded slowly. Jim Burns. He was Michael's partner in the exploration work they were doing. Was sick the day of the collapse, which probably saved his life. Lives over near Granite Creek now. Would he talk to us? For Michael's widow, I expect so. Carl glanced toward the window where afternoon light was already beginning to fade. But not today. You don't want to be on that mountain road after dark, especially with weather changing again. He was right. Dark clouds were gathering on the western horizon, suggesting another storm approaching. Eleanor felt Jackson's hand on her arm, a gentle reminder of the journey still ahead of them. We should start back, he said, rising from the table. Thank you both for your help. As they prepared to leave, Margaret pulled Eleanor aside for a private word while the men retrieved the horses. Are you truly all right, Eleanor? Her concern was genuine, her eyes searching her friend's face for signs of distress or coercion. This arrangement with Thornhill, it's not just about protection, is it? The question caught Eleanor off guard. She'd been so focused on practical concerns, on strategies against Hargrove, that she'd given little thought to how her relationship with Jackson might appear to others or how it was evolving in reality. It started as a practical partnership, she admitted, but it's becoming more. More, Margaret pressed gently. Eleanor struggled to articulate the shifting nature of her feelings for Jackson. The growing respect, the comfortable familiarity, the occasional moments when his presence stirred something deeper and more primal within her. He sees me, she said finally, not as someone to be protected or pitied, but as a partner, an equal. She met Margaret's concerned gaze directly. That's something I never had with Michael for all that our marriage was comfortable. Understanding dawned in Margaret's eyes. Just be careful, Eleanor. Not of Thornhill necessarily, but of the situation you're both in. Danger has a way of creating bonds that might not survive in calmer times. The warning was kindly meant, and Eleanor accepted it with a grateful nod. But as she and Jackson began their journey back to the mountain, she found herself reflecting on Margaret's words with growing certainty that her friend had misunderstood. The connection forming between herself and Jackson wasn't merely a response to external threat, though that had certainly accelerated their alliance. It was something more fundamental, a recognition of complementary strengths and shared values that transcended their unusual beginning. The return journey was slower than their morning ride, hampered by deteriorating weather and fading light. Snow began to fall as they reached the steeper sections of the mountain road, large flakes swirling around them in the gathering dusk. We'll need to take shelter soon, Jackson called above the rising wind. The storm's moving in faster than I expected. Eleanor nodded agreement, her face already numbed by cold despite the scarf wrapped around her lower features. The temperature had dropped precipitously with nightfall, transforming the merely uncomfortable into the potentially dangerous. They had just rounded a sharp bend in the road when Jackson suddenly reined his horse to a halt, one hand raised in a silent command to stop. Eleanor complied instantly, years of frontier life having taught her to trust such warnings without question. For several long moments they sat motionless in the growing storm, Jackson's head slightly tilted as he listened for something beyond the wind's mournful keening. Then with deliberate slowness, he dismounted, motioning for Eleanor to do the same. "What is it?" she whispered as he led both horses off the road into the shelter of towering pines. "Riders ahead," he murmured, his voice barely audible above the storm. "Waiting around the next bend." Fear shot through Eleanor like ice water in her veins. Hargrove's men, most likely. Jackson secured the horses, then reached for the rifle strapped to his saddle. "Stay here, I need to see how many we're dealing with." "Jackson, I'll be right back." His massive hand squeezed her shoulder briefly, reassurance and promise combined. "Keep the horses quiet." Before she could protest further, he melted into the swirling snow and gathering darkness, moving with the silent efficiency she'd glimpsed during their earlier explorations. For all his size, Jackson Thornhill could move like a ghost when necessary, another skill honed during his mysterious wartime service. Left alone with the restless horse, and Eleanor fought to control her mounting anxiety. The coincidence seemed too great. In armed riders positioned along their route home waiting in a snowstorm. This was no chance encounter with travelers or hunters. Minutes stretched endlessly. The snow fell more heavily, accumulating on Eleanor's hat and shoulders despite the partial shelter of the pines. The horses shifted nervously, sensing her tension even as she stroked their necks and murmured soothing nonsense. When Jackson finally returned, materializing from the white void as silently as he'd departed, Eleanor nearly cried out in relief. "3 men, he reported, crouching beside her, armed, positioned to ambush anyone coming from the direction of the Thompson farm. They're not moving despite the storm." "Waiting for us specifically," Eleanor concluded, her worst fears confirmed. Jackson nodded grimly. "They know this is the only road back to our property. They'll wait as long as necessary." "What do we do?" "We go around," Jackson straightened, checking the rifle's loading mechanism with practiced hands. "There's a game trail about a quarter-mile back. Difficult terrain, especially in these conditions, but it will take us wide of their position and eventually reconnect with the main road closer to home." The alternative route proved to be everything Jackson had warned: steep, treacherous, and barely visible beneath fresh fallen snow. They led the horses on foot, each step requiring careful placement to avoid hidden obstacles or treacherous ice. Darkness enveloped them completely, leaving only Jackson's uncanny sense of direction and occasional glimpses of landmarks when wind momentarily cleared the driving snow. Eleanor lost all sense of time, her world narrowing to the next step, the next handhold, the constant struggle against cold and exhaustion. "Stay with me, Eleanor." Jackson's voice reached her through the storm's howl, his hand finding hers to help her over a particularly difficult section. "Not much further now." She nodded, too cold for speech, her fingers numb even within heavy gloves. Part of her recognized the danger of their situation. Nighttime mountain travel during a snowstorm was perilous even for experienced outdoorsmen. But a deeper calm prevailed, born of absolute trust in Jackson's abilities and their shared determination to reach safety. When they finally regained the main road, Eleanor could barely distinguish it from the surrounding terrain, all landmarks obscured by darkness and swirling white. But Jackson moved with renewed confidence, leading them forward at a pace that suggested familiar territory. "The property boundary is just ahead," he called back to her. "Another mile to the house." The news brought fresh energy to Eleanor's tired limbs. Home, or what had become home with surprising speed, waited just beyond the storm's fury. Warmth, safety, the comfort of solid walls against winter's assault. They had almost reached the cleared path to the main house when Jackson suddenly stiffened, one hand raised in the now familiar signal to halt. Eleanor froze, straining to hear whatever had alerted him over the storm's constant voice. Then she heard it too, the distinctive metallic click of a rifle being cocked, followed by a harsh voice cutting through the wind's howl. "That's far enough, Thornhill." Three figures emerged from the swirling snow, positioned to block their path. Even in the poor visibility, Eleanor could see they were armed rifles trained on Jackson, with unwavering steadiness, despite the storm. "Hargrove sends his regards," the central figure continued, his voice carrying a mocking edge. "Says you and the widow have something that belongs to him." Jackson's posture shifted subtly, weight-balanced muscles tensed for action. But the odds were poor, three armed men at close range with Eleanor, vulnerable beside him. "We have nothing that belongs to Hargrove," Jackson replied, his deep voice carrying above the wind. "Unless he's claiming ownership of honest citizens now." The leader, a hard-faced man with a scar bisecting his left eyebrow, laughed without humor. "Hargrove owns whatever he decides to collect on, including Michael Wright's debt and whatever claim the widow's hiding." Eleanor felt a chill that had nothing to do with the frigid air. They knew about the claim, or at least suspected its existence. This wasn't just about Michael's debt, after all. "Step aside," Jackson said, his tone deceptively calm. "We're going home." "Oh, you're going somewhere," the scarred man agreed. "Just not where you planned. Hargrove wants a word with both of you, especially the lady." As he spoke, the other two men began to move outward, attempting to flank them. Jackson's hand moved imperceptibly toward the rifle still strapped across his back. "Don't try it, giant," the leader warned, his own weapon trained on Jackson's chest. "I've got no problem putting a hole in you right here." Eleanor saw calculation in Jackson's eyes, assessing distances, angles, possibilities. She knew with sudden certainty that he was preparing to act despite the overwhelming odds. "Jackson," she murmured, her voice barely audible. "Don't." His eyes met hers briefly, fierce, determined, unwilling to surrender. But before either of them could move, a new voice joined the confrontation. "Evening, gentlemen." Thomas Blackburn's wiry figure materialized from the storm, a shotgun cradled casually in his arms. "Bit cold to be standing around, isn't it?" The interruption created momentary confusion, exactly what Jackson needed. With explosive speed that belied his size, he lunged forward, disarming the leader before the man could react. At the same moment, Thomas fired a warning shot into the air, the shotgun's blast momentarily drowning the storm's voice. "Next one won't be aimed skyward," the old man drawled, leveling his weapon at the remaining armed figures. "Suggest you boys reconsider your evening plans." What followed was a brief, violent struggle, Jackson subduing the leader with ruthless efficiency, while the other two men retreated, unwilling to test Thomas's resolve or shooting ability. Within minutes, all three of Hargrove's men had been disarmed, their weapons collected by a grimly efficient Jackson. "What now?" Eleanor asked, her voice steadier than she'd expected given the circumstances. Jackson studied their prisoners with cold assessment. "We can't take them to the house, too dangerous having them know the layout. and the storm makes reaching town impossible. My cabin's closest, Thomas suggested. Sturdy door with a good lock. Could hold them until morning when we can get word to the sheriff. It was the most practical solution under the circumstances. With Thomas leading the way and Jackson guarding the sullen prisoners, they set off through the storm once more, this time toward the old man's homestead. Thomas's cabin proved to be similar to the hunting lodge Jackson had shown Eleanor, small but solidly built with a single room dominated by a stone fireplace. The old man worked quickly to light lamps and stoke the banked fire while Jackson secured their prisoners. "Been expecting trouble," Thomas commented as he prepared coffee for his unexpected guests. "When I saw fresh tracks heading up the mountain this morning, tracks that turned off before reaching your place, figured someone was setting up an ambush." "Good thing you decided to investigate," Eleanor said gratefully, accepting a steaming cup with hands that still trembled from cold and fading adrenaline. Thomas shrugged the gesture, dismissing his role in their rescue. "Neighbors look out for each other up here. Besides, I've got no love for Hargrove or his methods. Man tried to claim my southern pasture last year, said I'd signed it over as collateral on a loan I never took." The revelation added another piece to their understanding of Hargrove's operations and confirmed the pattern of fraudulent claims they'd suspected. "How did you resolve it?" Jackson asked, joining them by the fire after ensuring their prisoners were securely bound. "Shot his witnesses in the leg when they tried to remove my fence posts." Thomas's weathered face showed no remorse at the admission. Amazing how quickly a man's memory clears when he's bleeding into his boot. The blunt frontier justice might have shocked Eleanor once. Now understanding the threat Hargrove presented, she found herself nodding in grim approval. "These three will need more official handling," Jackson observed, glancing toward their captives. "The sheriff needs to be involved if we're going to build a case against Hargrove himself." "Sheriff Daniels is a decent man but cautious," Thomas warned. "Won't move against someone like Hargrove without solid evidence." "Then we'll provide it," Eleanor said with quiet determination. "Starting with the testimony of men caught attempting kidnapping during a blizzard." The storm showed no signs of abating, forcing them to remain at Thomas's cabin for the night. The old man insisted Eleanor take his bed, while he and Jackson maintained watch over their prisoners in shifts. Despite exhaustion, Eleanor found sleep elusive, her mind racing with implications of the evening's events. Hargrove had escalated from observation to direct action with alarming speed. The men's specific mention of a claim confirmed he was after more than Michael's debt. He wanted the mining location hidden in the Bible's binding, and he was willing to resort to violence and kidnapping to obtain it. More troubling still was the timing. How had Hargrove's men known they would be returning from the Thompson farm that evening? The most likely explanation, that someone had informed him of their visit, suggested a network of informants more extensive than they'd realized. Could Margaret or Carl have betrayed them? Eleanor dismissed the thought immediately. The Thompsons' concern had been genuine, their information freely given. But someone else might have observed their arrival or departure, someone with connections to Hargrove or Judge Thompson. When morning finally had arrived, the storm had passed, leaving behind a transformed landscape of pristine white. Jackson departed early to fetch the sheriff, leaving Eleanor and Thomas to guard their increasingly restless prisoners. "Hargrove won't take this lying down," the leader, who had identified himself only as Beck, warned as Eleanor brought him water. "You've no idea who you're dealing with, lady." "I know exactly who I'm dealing with," Eleanor replied coolly. "A man who preys on others' desperation, who arranges accidents when debts can't be paid, who forges documents to steal what isn't his." Beck's expression flickered with momentary surprise before hardening once more. "Pretty stories. Good luck proving any of it." "We won't need luck," Eleanor said with more confidence than she felt. "Just the testimony of men like you when facing prison sentences for attempted kidnapping." The threat of legal consequences had its intended effect. Beck fell silent, his earlier bravado replaced by calculating assessment that suggested he was weighing his options, and possibly his loyalty to Hargrove. Sheriff Daniels arrived mid-morning with Jackson and two deputies, a small, wiry man whose unassuming appearance belied the shrewd intelligence in his eyes. He listened to their account of the previous night's events without interruption, occasionally making notes in a small, leather-bound book. "Serious charges," he observed when they finished. "Attempted kidnapping during a blizzard, that's not just criminal, it's dangerously stupid." Beck and his companions were loaded into the sheriff's wagon, their protests falling on unsympathetic ears. Before departing, Sheriff Daniels drew Jackson and Eleanor aside for a private word. Hargrove has friends in high places, he warned, his voice pitched low to avoid being overheard, including Judge Thompson, who will likely be handling initial hearings in this matter. We're aware, Jackson acknowledged, but the evidence is clear enough that even Thompson will have difficulty dismissing it entirely. Daniels didn't appear convinced. Perhaps, but be careful, both of you. Hargrove isn't used to opposition, and men like that tend to react poorly when challenged. The warning delivered with evident sincerity underscored the danger of their situation. They had won this initial confrontation, but the larger conflict was just beginning. After the sheriff departed with his prisoners, Thomas insisted on accompanying them back to their homestead. Safety in numbers, he argued when Jackson protested. Besides, my old bones could use a proper meal after all this excitement. The return journey proved uneventful, though all three remained vigilant for signs of further ambush. The house appeared undisturbed when they arrived, but Jackson insisted on a thorough inspection before allowing Eleanor inside. All clear, he reported after checking every room. No sign anyone's been here during our absence. Relief washed through Eleanor as she entered the familiar space that had so quickly become home. After the tension and danger of the previous night, the solid walls and comfortable furnishings offered sanctuary and reassurance. Thomas stayed for a late breakfast, regaling them with stories of his own encounters with Hargrove's operatives over the years. Man's been building his little empire for nearly a decade, he explained between bites of bacon. Started small loans to miners and homesteaders during hard times. But his ambitions grew with his success. And how has he avoided legal consequences for so long? Eleanor asked, genuinely curious about the mechanics of such extended corruption. Money opens doors, Thomas replied with the cynicism of age, and closes mouths that might otherwise speak uncomfortable truths. Add a cooperative judge and a few well-placed allies in territorial government, and a man like Hargrove becomes practically untouchable. No one is untouchable, Jackson observed quietly. Every man has vulnerabilities if you know where to look. Thomas studied him with newfound interest. Sound like a man who's done some looking in his time. Jackson didn't respond directly, but something in his expression confirmed the old man's assessment. Eleanor was reminded again of his wartime service, the specialized unit, the operations behind enemy lines. Jackson Thornhill was indeed a man who understood how to identify and exploit vulnerabilities. After Thomas departed, promising to remain vigilant for any signs of renewed threat, Eleanor and Jackson found themselves alone for the first time since the previous day's journey to the Thompson farm. The events of the past 24 hours had altered something between them, deepened their alliance perhaps, or confirmed its necessity beyond initial practical considerations. We should discuss our next steps, Jackson said as they cleared away breakfast dishes. Hargrove will regroup quickly after last night's failure. Eleanor nodded agreement, already considering options. We need to speak with Jim Burns, Michael's former partner. If anyone knows details about the mine collapse or the claim Michael was so excited about, it would be him. Agreed, but we should wait a few days, let the situation with Beck and his men develop. Jackson's practical assessment matched her own thinking. Their testimony could be valuable if they turn against Hargrove to save themselves. And in the meantime, Jackson's expression grew contemplative. In the meantime, we continue preparations here. And perhaps consider what we'll do if we actually locate Michael's claim and it proves as valuable as he believed. The question caught Eleanor by surprise. She'd been so focused on immediate dangers and defensive strategies that she hadn't considered the potential implications of actually possessing a valuable mining claim. I suppose it would belong to both of us, she said after a moment's consideration. Given our arrangement, Jackson studied her face, his pale eyes unreadable. Our arrangement was for 1 month of cohabitation before any formal commitment. We're barely a week into that period. The reminder of their original terms hung between them, highlighting how dramatically circumstances had changed since Eleanor had first agreed to Jackson's proposal. Then she had been a desperate widow seeking security. He a solitary giant offering partnership and the possibility of children. Now they were allies against a common enemy, their lives entangled in ways neither had anticipated. Perhaps we should revisit those terms, Eleanor suggested carefully. Perhaps we should. Jackson's voice remained neutral, giving no indication of his thoughts on the matter. But not today. We've had enough complications for now. The practical deferral was characteristic of him addressing immediate concerns before emotional considerations. Eleanor found herself both relieved and vaguely disappointed by his response. As they settled into household tasks for the remainder of the day, a comfortable silence descended between them. There would be time enough for personal discussions once the threat from Hargrove was addressed. For now, their focus needed to remain on survival and strategy. Yet as evening approached and they moved through the familiar routine of meal preparation and fireside activities, Eleanor found herself watching Jackson with new awareness. The giant who had appeared during a blizzard with an outlandish proposal had become something more complex, more essential to her existence than she had ever anticipated. Not just a protector or partner of convenience, but a man whose strength matched her own, whose determination complemented her resilience. A man who had faced death at her side without flinching, who respected her intelligence and valued her contributions to their shared challenges. As she prepared for bed that night, Eleanor paused at her bedroom door, watching Jackson bank the main fire as he had every evening since her arrival. The domestic ritual had become comforting in its predictability, a small constant in their increasingly uncertain circumstances. "Jackson," she called softly. He straightened, turning toward her with a questioning expression. "Thank you," she said simply, "for last night, for all of it." His features softened slightly, the stern lines relaxing into something warmer. "We protected each other, Eleanor. That's what partners do." Partners, the word encompassed so much more than their initial arrangement had suggested. Not merely a practical alliance or convenient protection, but a genuine sharing of burdens and strengths. "Good night then, partner," she said, testing the term with a small smile. "Good night, Eleanor." His answering smile, rare and transformative, lingered in her mind as she closed her bedroom door. Outside, the night settled cold and clear over the snow-covered mountain. Stars emerged in brilliant profusion, their light reflecting off white blanketed slopes to create a landscape of ethereal beauty. Within the sturdy walls of their shared home, Eleanor and Jackson rested in the temporary peace of a battle postponed, not abandoned but momentarily distant. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new strategies in their conflict with Hargrove. But tonight, in the aftermath of danger, survived together, they had found something precious. The certainty that neither faced the future alone. 3 days passed in watchful quiet. Snow melted on south-facing slopes, revealing patches of earth like islands in a white sea. Each morning, Jackson patrolled the property boundaries, alert for signs of intruders or surveillance. Each evening, they reviewed defensive preparations, refining strategies and contingencies with meticulous care. News arrived via Thomas Blackburn, who made daily visits on the pretext of neighborly concern. Beck and his companions remained in custody, but Judge Thompson had scheduled their hearing with unusual haste. 2 days from now, Thomas reported, accepting the coffee Eleanor offered. "Faster than I've ever seen the judge move a case to his docket." "Hargrove's influence," Jackson observed, his expression grim. "He'll want his men released quickly." "Sheriff's doing his best to build a proper case," Thomas added, "but without witnesses beyond ourselves." The implication was clear: their testimony alone might not be sufficient against Hargrove's legal maneuvering and the judge's cooperation. "We need to speak with Jim Burns," Eleanor said, the decision forming as she spoke. "Today, if possible. If he can provide testimony about Michael's mining activities or suspicious circumstances before the collapse, it might strengthen our position." Jackson nodded agreement. "Granite Creek isn't far. We could reach it by midday if we leave soon." The journey to Granite Creek took them along narrow valley roads, the surrounding hills showing increasing signs of mining activity as they approached the small settlement. Tailings piles marked abandoned operations, while occasional plumes of smoke indicated active claims still being worked despite winter conditions. Granite Creek itself proved to be little more than a cluster of rough buildings serving the needs of miners and prospectors, a general store, saloon, assayer's office, and scattered cabins perched along the creek that gave the settlement its name. "Jim Burns keeps to himself these days," the storekeeper informed them when asked. "Cabin up Boulder Draw about a mile north. Doesn't come to town much, except for supplies." The directions led them to a small but well-maintained cabin nestled against a rocky hillside. Smoke curled from the stone chimney, and neatly stacked firewood lined one wall, signs of habitation and orderly living. The man who answered their knock was younger than Eleanor had expected, perhaps 40, with a lean build and watchful eyes that assessed them quickly. A pronounced limp became evident as he stepped onto the porch, closing the cabin door firmly behind him. "Jim Burns?" Jackson inquired, removing his hat respectfully. "Depends who's asking." The man's posture remained cautious, one hand resting near his belt, where Eleanor noticed the outline of a concealed weapon. "My name is Jackson Thornhill. This is Eleanor Wright, Michael Wright's widow." The name triggered an immediate reaction, surprise, followed by wary recognition. "Michael's wife. He spoke of you often." Burns's gaze moved between them, clearly noting the absence of traditional mourning attire and Eleanor's apparent connection to Jackson. "What brings you here after all this time?" "Questions about Michael's death," Eleanor replied directly, "and about the claim he was developing before the mine collapse." Burns's expression closed immediately. "Don't know anything about any special claim. Michael and I worked the Blue Creek mine together, that's all." The denial came too quickly, too emphatically to be entirely truthful. Eleanor exchanged glances with Jackson, who gave a slight nod permission to lead the questioning. "Mr. Burns," she said gently, "we found Michael's map, the one hidden in his Bible's binding." Color drained from Burns' weathered face. His eyes darted to the surrounding area as if checking for observers. "You'd better come inside," he said after a long moment, pushing the door open wider. "This isn't a conversation for open air." The cabin's interior was surprisingly comfortable, clean and well-organized with handmade furniture and shelves lined with books, suggesting a man of greater education than the average miner. A coal stove provided steady heat, and maps covered one wall marked with notations and calculations. "You're a geologist," Jackson observed, noting the technical volumes and mineral specimens displayed on a side table. Burns nodded, gesturing for them to sit. "Studied at Columbia before coming west. Found I preferred fieldwork to academic theory." He settled into a chair opposite them, his earlier wariness not entirely dispelled. "Now what's this about Michael's map?" Eleanor described, finding the hidden document, watching Burns's reaction carefully. The former partners had clearly shared more than casual working knowledge. "Michael found something, didn't he?" she pressed, when Burns remained silent. "Something valuable enough to borrow money to develop." "From Hargrove," Jackson added. "Money that might have gotten him killed when he couldn't repay it." The combined revelations visibly shook Burns. He rose abruptly, moving to a cabinet from which he withdrew a bottle of whiskey and 3 glasses. "You think Michael's death wasn't an accident?" It wasn't a question. "We have reason to believe it wasn't," Eleanor confirmed, accepting the offered drink, though she had no intention of consuming it. "And that Victor Hargrove was involved." Burns downed his whiskey in a single swallow, then refilled his glass with a slightly trembling hand. "I've suspected for 18 months, he admitted finally. "But suspicion isn't proof, and a man like Hargrove, well, accidents happen to those who make accusations without evidence." "We're gathering evidence now," Jackson said, "starting with whatever you can tell us about Michael's activities before his death." Burns studied them both, weighing his options. Whatever he saw in their expressions apparently satisfied him, for he set down his glass and moved to a locked chest in the corner of the room. "Michael wasn't just my business partner," he said as he worked the combination lock. "He was the closest thing to a friend I had in these mountains. If Hargrove had him killed—" The sentence remained unfinished, but the cold fury in his voice completed the thought effectively. From the chest, Burns retrieved a leather portfolio, which he placed on the table between them. "Michael brought this to me 3 days before the collapse. Asked me to keep it safe, said he'd explain everything when he returned from a meeting in Helena." His voice caught slightly. "That was the last time I saw him alive." Eleanor opened the portfolio with careful fingers. Inside were detailed geological surveys, assay reports, and several hand-drawn maps similar to the one they'd found in Michael's Bible, but far more precise and technical. "Silverwood," Burns explained as they examined the documents, "the richest vein I've seen in 20 years of prospecting. Not just a pocket or a narrow seam, but a true mother lode running deep into the mountain." Jackson whistled softly as he studied the assay figures. "This would be worth—" "A fortune," Burns confirmed. "Enough to make Michael one of the wealthiest men in the territory. Enough to attract dangerous attention if word got out before he secured proper backing and protection." "Which is why he borrowed it from Hargrove," Eleanor realized. "He needed immediate capital to file proper claims and begin development before someone else discovered the location." Burns nodded. "Michael was desperate to keep it quiet until everything was official. But he needed money. He didn't have equipment, hired men bribes to the right officials to expedite paperwork. And Hargrove was the only source of quick cash, Jackson concluded grimly. The worst possible choice, Burns agreed, but Michael was convinced he could repay the loan quickly once production began. He never imagined that Hargrove would want more than repayment, Eleanor finished, that he'd want the claim itself. The pieces fit together with terrible logic. Michael discovers an incredibly valuable silver deposit. Needing development capital quickly, he turns to Hargrove, not realizing the lender's predatory nature. Hargrove, recognizing the potential value far exceeds the loan amount, arranges an accident before Michael can file complete documentation or repay the debt. Did Michael file any official claim paperwork before his death? Jackson asked the practical question, cutting through Eleanor's painful realizations. Preliminary filings only, Burns replied. Enough to establish basic rights, but not detailed enough to locate the vein precisely without the supplementary maps and surveys. He gestured to the documents before them. That's why these materials are so valuable and so dangerous. And why Hargrove has been watching Eleanor, Jackson added. He believes she has this information that Michael would have shared the exact location with his wife. But he never did, Eleanor said softly, the familiar mixture of grief and frustration washing through her. Michael kept so many secrets, thinking he was protecting me. Burns's expression softened with unexpected compassion. He wanted to surprise you. The night before he died, he told me he was planning to take you to see the claim site once everything was official. Said he was going to build you a proper house, the kind a woman like you deserved. The revelation brought tears to Eleanor's eyes, not for the material comforts Michael had envisioned, but for the hope and love behind his secretive planning. For all their marriage's limitations, Michael had genuinely wanted to provide for her to create a better life than their struggling homestead had offered. Mr. Burns, Jackson said after allowing a respectful moment for Eleanor's emotions, would you be willing to testify about these matters, about Michael's discovery and his dealings with Hargrove? The question sobered Burns immediately. Testify where in Judge Thompson's court. He shook his head emphatically. That would be suicide. Thompson's firmly in Hargrove's pocket. Not in local court, Jackson clarified. We need to take this to territorial authorities officials beyond Hargrove's immediate influence. That's a 3-day journey to Helena, Burns pointed out, assuming we could even get an audience with the territorial magistrate. We have connections, Eleanor said, thinking of her father's former position and the letters of introduction he'd provided years ago when she and Michael first journeyed west. Long unused, those documents might still carry weight in official circles. Burns remained unconvinced. Even if you reached the territorial authorities, Hargrove wouldn't sit on while you built a case against him. The moment he suspects you're gathering evidence, he left the threat unspoken but clear. He already suspects, Jackson pointed out. The attempted kidnapping proves he's moving beyond legal maneuvering to direct action. The reminder of their narrowly averted abduction seemed to strengthen Burns's resolve. I owe it to Michael, he said finally, but we need to move carefully. Hargrove has eyes everywhere, especially in town. They spent the next hour developing a strategy. Burns would compile the most critical evidence documents showing Michael's legitimate claim and suggesting Hargrove's possible involvement in the mine collapse. Eleanor would locate her father's letters of introduction to territorial officials. Jackson would arrange secure transportation to Helena, bypassing the regular stage routes that Hargrove might monitor. 3 days, Jackson concluded as they prepared to leave. We meet at Thomas Blackburn's hunting cabin with whatever we've gathered. From there, we travel together to Helena. Burns agreed, though his expression remained troubled. Watch your backs. If Hargrove gets wind of this plan, we'll be careful, Eleanor assured him, understanding his concern. And Mr. Burns, thank you for keeping Michael's discovery safe and for being willing to help us now. The former geologist nodded, his eyes showing a mixture of determination and lingering grief. Michael was a good man. He deserved better than what happened to him. Making that right, it's long overdue. The return journey passed in thoughtful silence, both Eleanor and Jackson processing the implications of Burns's revelations. The confirmation of Michael's valuable discovery and the likelihood of Hargrove's involvement in his death changed their situation significantly, raising both the stakes and potential rewards of their confrontation. We should tell Thomas, Eleanor suggested as they approached the turnoff to their property. He's already involved and will need his cabin as a meeting point. Jackson nodded agreement. Tonight after dark, less chance of being observed. But their plans for secrecy were rendered moot before they even reached home. As they crested the final rise overlooking their property, Eleanor gasped at the sight that greeted them. 3 carriages stood in the yard before their house, accompanied by mounted men whose polished boots and formal attire suggested official business rather than Hargrove's hired thugs. At the center of the gathering stood a distinguished figure Eleanor recognized immediately, despite the distance. Judge Robert Thompson, his black judicial robes incongruous against the rural setting. "What on earth?" she breathed instinctively, reining her horse to a halt. Jackson's expression darkened as he surveyed the scene. "Legal ambush," he said tersely. "They're forcing our hand." "How, on what grounds?" "We'll find out soon enough." Jackson straightened in his saddle resolution, replacing surprise. "Stay close to me. Let me do the talking initially." As they approached, the assembled group turned toward them with the coordinated movement of men who had been awaiting their arrival. Judge Thompson stepped forward, his patrician features arranged in an expression of official gravity. "Mr. Thornhill, Mrs. Wright." He deliberately used Eleanor's previous name, the calculated insult, establishing his position immediately. "Your presence is required for official proceedings regarding certain claims against this property." Jackson dismounted with deliberate calm, then moved to assist Eleanor from her horse. His large hands lingered at her waist, momentarily reassurance and promise combined in the subtle contact. "What claims would those be, Judge Thompson?" he asked, his deep voice carrying across the yard without effort. The judge gestured to a thin man in expensive Eastern attire who stood slightly behind him. "Mr. Victor Hargrove has presented documentation regarding an outstanding debt owed by the late Michael Wright. As Mr. Wright's widow and heir, Mrs. Wright is legally responsible for this obligation." Eleanor studied Hargrove with intense interest, finally putting a face to the name that had cast such a shadow over her life. He was not what she had expected, neither physically imposing nor obviously sinister. Rather, he possessed the polished appearance and confident demeanor of a successful businessman, his only distinctive feature being unusually cold eyes that assessed her with calculating precision. "I see," Jackson replied, his tone neutral, despite the tension evident in his posture. "And you've brought this documentation directly to our home, rather than issuing a proper summons to court because—" Judge Thompson's mouth tightened at the implied criticism. "Given the remote nature of your residence and recent incidents involving Mr. Hargrove's employees, I deemed it appropriate to address this matter personally and promptly." "How considerate," Jackson observed the dry comment, causing several of the accompanying officials to shift uncomfortably. Eleanor stepped forward, finding her voice despite the intimidating circumstances. "May I examine this alleged documentation?" Hargrove smiled thinly, producing a leather portfolio similar to the one Burns had shown them, though she suspected the contents were very different. "Of course, Mrs. Wright. Everything is in order, I assure you." The documents appeared professional and legitimate at first glance. A promissory note bearing what appeared to be Michael's signature, witness statements attesting to the loan agreement, detailed calculations of principal and accumulated interest. But Eleanor had seen Michael's genuine handwriting that very day in Burns's cabin, and the signature, while skillfully executed, showed subtle differences only a spouse would recognize. "This signature is forged," she said flatly, looking directly at Hargrove. "My husband never signed this document." Hargrove's expression didn't change, but something flickered in his cold eyes, irritation, or perhaps surprise at her directness. "A serious accusation," Judge Thompson interjected smoothly. "Do you have evidence to support such a claim?" "I have intimate familiarity with my husband's handwriting," Eleanor replied, meeting the judge's gaze steadily, "and I have examples of his genuine signature that can be compared to this forgery by experts." "Grief often clouds judgment," Hargrove suggested with false sympathy. "Perhaps Mrs. Wright was simply unaware of her husband's financial arrangements, as many wives are." The condescension might have intimidated Eleanor once. Now strengthened by all she had learned and by Jackson's solid presence beside her, she felt only cold determination. "Perhaps Mr. Hargrove was unaware that my husband kept detailed records of all his financial dealings," she countered, "records that make no mention of this alleged loan." A charged silence followed her statement. Judge Thompson glanced at Hargrove, whose composed expression had hardened almost imperceptibly. "Regardless of disputed signatures," the judge said finally, Mr. Hargrove has presented legally witnessed documentation of a debt that remains unpaid. As such, he has filed for transfer of property rights to satisfy this obligation. On what valuation? Jackson demanded the practical question, catching Thompson momentarily off guard. The debt with accrued interest totals $1,500, Hargrove stated smoothly. This property with improvements and livestock has been assessed at approximately $2,000. By whom? Jackson pressed. By appointed assessors from Silver Creek, the judge answered, gesturing to two men who stood uncomfortably near the carriages. Their findings are included in the documentation. Eleanor recognized one of the men as a shopkeeper who had frequently extended credit to struggling miners, a man whose business had mysteriously prospered in recent years, despite economic hardships affecting most local merchants. The connection to Hargrove seemed suddenly obvious. We contest both the debt and the assessment, Jackson stated firmly, and we request a formal hearing before the territorial magistrate rather than local jurisdiction. Judge Thompson's expression darkened. That is your right, of course, but until such a hearing can be arranged, which may take considerable time, given the territorial court's backlog, an injunction will be placed on this property preventing transfer or alteration. Meaning what exactly? Eleanor asked, though she suspected she already knew. Meaning you cannot sell livestock, harvest timber, or make significant changes to the property until legal ownership is determined, Thompson clarified. Mr. Hargrove has generously agreed to allow continued residence during this period provided appropriate security is arranged. What kind of security? Jackson's voice had grown dangerously quiet. Hargrove stepped forward, clearly relishing the moment. Simply a bond to ensure the property remains in its current condition. Say $500, cash of course. The extortionate demand was clearly designed to be impossible. Few frontier households had access to such sums in liquid funds. Unable to pay the bond, they would be forced to vacate, leaving Hargrove free to take possession regardless of legal technicalities. That won't be necessary, came a new voice from the edge of the gathering. All heads turned to see Sheriff Daniels approaching on horseback, accompanied by Thomas Blackburn and, surprisingly, Carl Thompson. Sheriff, Judge Thompson acknowledged with poorly concealed annoyance. This is a civil matter not requiring your attention. Actually, Your Honor, it's become a criminal matter as well. Daniels dismounted, approaching with the unhurried confidence of a man accustomed to controlling tense situations. I've just come from interviewing Beck and his companions again. Seems they've had a change of heart about their employer. Hargrove's composed facade showed its first significant crack, a tightening around the eyes that suggested sudden calculation of changing odds. Jailhouse confessions from men seeking leniency are hardly reliable, he said dismissively. Perhaps not on their own, Daniels agreed, but when supported by financial records connecting you to payments for special services on the day of Michael Wright's death. He let the implication hang in the cold mountain air. Eleanor felt her heart lurch painfully. Here at last was the confirmation she had both sought and dreaded, evidence that Michael's death had indeed been orchestrated rather than accidental. Where did you obtain such records? Judge Thompson demanded, his judicial authority suddenly uncertain against the sheriff's calm certainty. From Jim Burns, Thomas Blackburn answered, stepping forward. Seems Michael's former partner kept better books than anyone suspected, including records of men hired to inspect the mine the day before it collapsed. The coordinated intervention suggested planning that must have occurred while Eleanor and Jackson were traveling home from Burns's cabin, connections forming and information being shared through channels Hargrove hadn't anticipated. This is absurd, Hargrove snapped, his cultivated manner cracking further. Mining accidents are common. Trying to transform a tragedy into conspiracy. Save it for the territorial magistrate, Sheriff Daniels interrupted. Judge Freeman arrived from Helena this morning specifically to address allegations of judicial impropriety in this district. He looked pointedly at Judge Thompson, whose face had gone notably pale. He's quite interested in examining certain cases involving property transfers over the past few years. The shifting balance of power was almost palpable. The officials who had accompanied Thompson began edging toward their horses, suddenly reluctant to be associated with the proceedings that had attracted territorial scrutiny. You have overstepped your authority, Sheriff, Thompson blustered, though his confident demeanor had crumbled beyond repair. Have I? Daniels appeared unperturbed by the accusation. Judge Freeman doesn't seem to think so, In fact, he's issued specific instructions regarding Mr. Hargrove and any property claims currently under review. From his coat, the sheriff produced an official-looking document bearing the territorial seal. All proceedings are suspended pending full investigation. Mr. Hargrove is to surrender all documentation relating to Michael Wright's alleged debt for examination by independent experts. Hargrove's calculated composure had been replaced by the wary tension of a predator suddenly finding itself surrounded. His gaze shifted between the various parties, reassessing options with visible precision. "This is a temporary setback at most," he said, finally addressing Eleanor directly for the first time. "Whatever evidence you think you've gathered won't withstand proper scrutiny." "Michael's maps and surveys might disagree," she replied steadily, watching his reaction with careful attention. The slight widening of his eyes confirmed what they had suspected. Hargrove's pursuit had always been about more than just debt collection. He wanted the silver claim, the motherlode that could transform mere wealth into empire. "If you're wise, Mrs. Wright," he said, voice lowered to ensure only she could hear, "you'll accept a reasonable settlement before matters become more unfortunate for everyone involved." "Are you threatening me, Mr. Hargrove?" Eleanor kept her tone conversational despite the hammering of her heart. "Merely offering practical advice." His cold eyes flicked to Jackson, who was engaged in conversation with Sheriff Daniels. "Men like your protector often meet unfortunate ends when they involve themselves in business beyond their understanding." Before Eleanor could respond, Jackson returned to her side, his massive presence seemingly pushing Hargrove back through sheer physical displacement. "Sheriff Daniels requires Hargrove's documentation," he informed her, his hand coming to rest protectively at the small of her back. "And Judge Thompson has been summoned to Silver Creek to explain certain irregularities in recent rulings." The official party departed within minutes, Hargrove's smooth facade restored, though considerably less convincing than before. Judge Thompson rode with the rigid posture of a man facing professional ruin, while the accompanying officials maintained careful distance from both men, already distancing themselves from the coming disgrace. When the last carriage had disappeared down the mountain road, Eleanor felt her knees threaten to buckle as tension drained from her body. Jackson's strong arm steadied her immediately. "It's not over," he cautioned as Thomas and Carl approached. "This is just the first skirmish." "But an important one," Thomas observed with grim satisfaction. "Territorial involvement changes everything. Hargrove's local influence means nothing to Judge Freeman." Carl nodded agreement. "Margaret deserves much of the credit. After your visit, she wrote to her cousin in Helena, a man with significant political connections. Apparently, her concerns about Robert's judicial conduct struck a chord in the territorial capital." The revelation of Margaret's behind-the-scenes intervention added another dimension to their unexpected reprieve. While they had been gathering evidence and forming direct strategies, quieter forces had been aligning to support their cause. "We should secure the property," Jackson said, practical concerns reasserting themselves. "Hargrove won't risk direct action while under official scrutiny, but his associates might act independently." The men moved to check outbuildings and boundaries, leaving Eleanor briefly alone in the yard. The confrontation had left her drained yet oddly exhilarated, not from victory, which remained far from certain, but from the simple act of standing her ground against intimidation. When Jackson returned from his inspection, he found her still standing where he'd left her, face turned toward the late afternoon sun. "Everything secure?" she asked, hearing his approach without turning. "For now." He moved to stand beside her, his solid presence a comfort she'd grown increasingly accustomed to. "Thomas and Carl are preparing to leave. Thomas will return tonight to help keep watch." Eleanor nodded, grateful for the continued alliance. "Jackson," she said after a moment's hesitation, "what Hargrove said before you returned. He threatened you specifically. Said men like you often meet unfortunate ends." Jackson's expression didn't change, but something hardened in his pale eyes. "Hargrove makes a practice of threatening what people value most," he said quietly. "It's how he identifies their vulnerabilities." The implication that Hargrove had identified her concern for Jackson as a potential weakness to exploit brought a complex mixture of emotions, fear for Jackson's safety, but also recognition of how essential he had become to her in their short time together. "I won't let anything happen to you," she said firmly, surprising herself with the protective fierceness in her voice. A rare smile touched Jackson's features, transforming his scarred face with unexpected warmth. That works both ways, Eleanor. The simple response carried more reassurance than elaborate promises might have. This was their partnership, now mutual protection, shared determination, each watching over the other with equal commitment. That evening after Thomas had departed with promises to return by nightfall, Eleanor and Jackson found themselves truly alone for the first time since the previous day's journey to visit Burns. The confrontation with Hargrove and subsequent intervention had left them little time for private conversation. As they prepared a simple dinner together, Eleanor found herself studying Jackson with new awareness. The giant who had first appeared during a blizzard with an outlandish proposal had become something far more complex and essential ally protector partner in a struggle that had evolved far beyond their original arrangement. "You're thinking very loudly," Jackson observed as he sliced bread for their meal. Eleanor smiled at the perceptive comment, just reflecting on how much has changed in such a short time. "When you first proposed our arrangement, I never imagined we'd be facing legal battles and uncovering mining conspiracies together." "Nor did I," he admitted, setting the table with characteristic efficiency, "though I suspected Hargrove might eventually become an issue. Because of your promise to Michael." Jackson nodded, his expression growing more serious. "Michael knew the risks he was taking by borrowing from Hargrove. I think he suspected he might not survive to repay the debt. So he extracted your promise to protect me if anything happened to him." Eleanor completed the thought pieces, falling into place with painful clarity. "And you've honored that promise despite the danger to yourself." "I have," Jackson acknowledged, "but what began as obligation has become something else entirely." The admission hung between them, significant yet still undefined. Eleanor found herself holding her breath, waiting for him to continue. "Our original arrangement specified 1 month before any formal commitment," Jackson said carefully. "We're barely 2 weeks into that period." "Much has happened in those 2 weeks," Eleanor pointed out. "Yes," he agreed, his pale eyes studying her with unwavering attention. "Which is why I'm asking if you wish to continue as we are, or if you'd prefer to formalize our situation more officially." The question, delivered with Jackson's characteristic directness, nevertheless caught Eleanor by surprise. With Hargrove's threats still fresh and the legal battle barely begun, marriage seemed a secondary consideration. Yet as she considered his question, Eleanor realized their partnership had already progressed far beyond the tentative trial period they'd initially agreed upon. They had faced danger together, protected each other, begun building something that transcended practical convenience or temporary alliance. "I think," she said slowly, choosing her words with care, "that I would prefer to wait until Hargrove's threats are fully addressed before taking that step. Not because I'm uncertain of my commitment to our partnership, but because I want such a decision to be made in freedom rather than urgency." Jackson nodded, no disappointment evident in his expression, only thoughtful consideration of her reasoning. "That seems wise," he agreed, "though it leaves the question of our immediate arrangements." Eleanor understood his meaning immediately. Their partnership had developed emotional dimensions neither had initially anticipated, creating unspoken tension that simmered beneath practical concerns. "I believe our current arrangements are working well," she said, meeting his gaze directly despite the warmth rising in her cheeks. "Though perhaps—" She hesitated, then continued with determined honesty. "Perhaps there might be room for adjustment, as we both feel comfortable." In the deliberate ambiguity of her response allowed for possibilities without pressure or presumption. Jackson's slight smile suggested he understood both what she had said and what remained unspoken. "Adjustment," he repeated the word, carrying nuances beyond its simple syllables. "I can work with that." The moment of personal connection was interrupted by the sound of approaching hoofbeats, Thomas returning as promised to help maintain nighttime vigilance. The conversation shifted immediately to practical matters of security and surveillance. But something had changed between them, an acknowledgement of deepening connection and future possibilities that would remain even as external threats demanded their attention. That night, Eleanor lay awake longer than usual, her mind filled not with anxieties about Hargrove's threats or the legal complications ahead, but with thoughts of Jackson Thornhill and the unlikely partnership that had developed between them. She had come to his mountain seeking security and the possibility of children, accepting his proposals a practical solution to desperate circumstances. Instead, she had found herself embroiled in danger and intrigue, but also discovering strength she hadn't known she possessed and a connection to another human being more profound than anything she'd experienced in her previous marriage. Whatever the outcome of their conflict with Hargrove, Eleanor knew with growing certainty that her life had been irreversibly transformed by the giant with patient hands and watchful eyes who had appeared during a blizzard with an outlandish proposal. The following days brought a whirlwind of legal developments and strategic planning. Judge Freeman, the territorial magistrate, proved to be everything local officials were not: incorruptible, meticulous, and deeply suspicious of Hargrove's business practices. His presence in Silver Creek created ripples throughout the region as other victims of questionable property transfers came forward with their stories. Eleanor and Jackson traveled to town for formal depositions, providing detailed accounts of Hargrove's attempted intimidation and the kidnapping attempt by his men. Jim Burns contributed Michael's documentation regarding the silver claim, while Beck, seeking leniency for his own crimes, revealed damning details about Hargrove's instructions regarding Eleanor's abduction. He wanted the map Beck testified during proceeding Eleanor was permitted to observe. Said the right woman had documentation of a mining claim worth 50 times the original debt. We were to bring her to his Helena office by whatever means necessary. The accumulating evidence painted a picture of systematic corruption and criminal activity extending far beyond Michael's death. Judge Freeman expanded his investigation to include multiple questionable property transfers approved by Judge Thompson over the previous 3 years, each following a similar pattern of alleged debt and forced settlement. Through it all, Eleanor and Jackson maintained careful vigilance, never traveling alone and keeping their homestead secure against potential retaliation. Thomas Blackburn and Carl Thompson provided additional protection, creating a community alliance that stood firm against Hargrove's diminishing influence. "He's finished in this territory," Sheriff Daniels informed them after a particularly revealing day of testimony. "Even if he escapes prison, his business operations are being dismantled piece by piece." Yet despite these reassurances, Eleanor could not shake the sense that Hargrove remained dangerous, perhaps more so as his carefully constructed empire crumbled around him. Jackson shared her concerns, maintaining defensive preparations and watchfulness despite the increasingly favorable legal developments. Their caution proved justified on a clear spring morning, 3 weeks after the initial confrontation at their homestead. Eleanor woke to the scent of smoke, not the familiar aroma of breakfast preparation or banked hearth fires, but the acrid smell of burning outbuildings. She reached the bedroom window in time to see flames engulfing the barn, orange tongues licking upward against the lightning sky. Jackson was already in the yard leading panicked horses to safety while attempting to organize a bucket brigade from the nearby stream. Eleanor, dressed with frantic speed, rushing downstairs and outside to join the firefighting efforts. Thomas had arrived from his nearby cabin, and together the three of them fought to contain the blaze before it could spread to the main house or workshop. "Deliberate," Thomas gasped as they finally brought the fire under control, leaving the barn a smoldering ruin but preventing further destruction. "Found coal oil traces at the starting point." Jackson's expression was grim as he surveyed the damage. Hargrove's farewell message. He agreed, his voice tight with controlled anger. Making good on his threats even as his legal options collapse. The attack for there could be no doubt about its intentional nature crystallized something in Eleanor's mind. While the territorial investigation might eventually bring Hargrove to justice through official channels, he remained willing and able to strike from the shadows in the meantime. "This can't continue," she said, watching as the barn's remaining structure collapsed in a shower of sparks. "We can't live under constant threat of retaliation while legal proceedings drag on for months." Jackson nodded agreement, his face smoke-streaked and resolute. "Hargrove himself is the key. Without his direction, his remaining associates would have little motivation to continue these attacks." The implication was clear. Addressing the threat at its source would require direct confrontation with Hargrove himself rather than merely defending against his agents. It was a dangerous proposition, particularly with Hargrove already cornered and desperate. "He's staying at the Silver Creek Hotel," Thomas informed them, having gathered intelligence during his regular visits to town. "Territorial authorities have restricted his movements pending further investigation, but he's not under arrest yet." "Then that's where we go," Eleanor decided, the determination in her voice matching Jackson's expression. "Today, while he's still accessible but legally constrained." The plan they developed was simple by necessity. They would approach Hargrove directly, offering a settlement that would appeal to his self-interest, Eleanor would surrender all claim to Michael's silver discovery in exchange for Hargrove's immediate departure from the territory and cessation of all hostilities. He won't honor such an agreement, Jackson pointed out as they rode towards Silver Creek later that morning. Hargrove doesn't keep bargains unless forced to do so. I know, Eleanor acknowledged, but the offer gets us access to him directly under circumstances he believes favor his interests. What happens after that? She left the thought unfinished. Jackson studied her with quiet assessment. You've changed, Eleanor. Have I? The woman I first proposed to would never have suggested such a confrontation. His observation carried no judgment, merely recognition of transformation. She was strong but cautious, protective of her independence, but hesitant to engage threats directly. Eleanor considered his words, finding truth in them. That woman was still defining herself by what she'd lost, she said finally. By Michael's death, by her struggle to maintain his homestead, by her isolation. And now I understand that true independence comes from choosing one's connections rather than avoiding them. From facing threats alongside trusted allies rather than struggling alone against circumstances. The insight articulated as they rode side by side toward an uncertain confrontation crystallized something fundamental about their evolving partnership. What had begun as mutual convenience had transformed into shared purpose and genuine trust, a foundation far stronger than Eleanor's previous marriage had ever achieved. Silver Creek appeared unusually animated when they arrived the main street, bustling with activity centered around the courthouse. A crowd had gathered despite the early hour voices, raised in what appeared to be celebration rather than protest. What's happening? Eleanor asked a woman standing at the edge of the gathering. Judge Freeman just announced formal charges against Hargrove and Thompson, the woman replied excitedly. Fraud, corruption, conspiracy, even murder charges related to 3 separate accidents involving his debtors. They're to be transported to Helena immediately for trial. The news brought mixed emotions, relief that justice was proceeding, frustration that their planned confrontation might be thwarted by official action. Eleanor exchanged glances with Jackson, silently communicating the need to adjust their strategy. When is the transport scheduled? Jackson asked the informative townswomen. Within the hour, they're preparing the prison wagon now. She gestured toward the jailhouse, visible at the end of the street, where indeed a heavily reinforced vehicle stood, ready, guarded by territorial marshals rather than local deputies. Their window of opportunity was closing rapidly. Without discussion, Eleanor and Jackson urged their horses toward the Silver Creek Hotel, hoping to intercept Hargrove before the official transport removed him from reach. The hotel lobby was chaotic, staff hurriedly removing luggage under the supervision of stern-faced marshals, while curious onlookers pressed against windows to witness the downfall of a man who had dominated local commerce and politics for years. Mrs. Wright, Mr. Thornhill, Sheriff Daniels intercepted them at the entrance to the dining room, where apparently Hargrove was being permitted a final meal before transport. I'm afraid this area is restricted by order of Judge Freeman. We need 5 minutes with Hargrove, Eleanor said, keeping her voice low but insistent. There are matters regarding Michael's death that remain unaddressed by the official charges. Daniels hesitated, sympathy warring with professional obligation. The judge has been very specific about limiting access to the prisoners. This isn't about revenge or confrontation, Jackson assured him, though Eleanor noted he didn't specify what it was about. 5 minutes under your supervision if necessary. Perhaps it was their established credibility from previous testimony or simply the sheriff's own sense of justice recognizing Eleanor's right to closure regarding her husband's death. Whatever the reason, Daniels finally nodded reluctant agreement. 5 minutes, he emphasized, and I'll be present throughout. Hargrove sat alone at a corner table, the remains of what appeared to be an elaborate breakfast spread before him. Despite his circumstances, he maintained the composed appearance and precise movements of a man accustomed to control. Only his eyes, cold and calculating as ever, betrayed the fury beneath his cultivated exterior. Mrs. Wright, he acknowledged as they approached, deliberately ignoring Jackson's towering presence. Come to witness the spectacle of false justice. I assure you these absurd charges won't withstand proper legal scrutiny in Helena. Eleanor seated herself across from him without invitation, meeting his gaze with steady determination. I've come about Michael's silver claim, she said without preamble. The one you had him killed for when he couldn't repay your loan. If she had expected shock at the direct accusation, she was disappointed. Hargrove merely dabbed his lips with a napkin, his expression unchanging. "Mining accidents are tragically common," he replied smoothly. "Attempting to transform personal loss into conspiracy speaks more to your emotional state than to reality." Beck's testimony suggests otherwise, Jackson observed, remaining standing beside Eleanor like a protective mountain. As do the financial records Jim Burns provided. Something flickered in Hargrove's cold eyes, not fear precisely, but recalculation. Circumstantial connections that clever lawyers will dismantle within hours of reaching Helena. "Perhaps," Eleanor conceded, "but we're not here about legal proceedings. We're here to offer a settlement regarding the claim itself." This caught Hargrove's attention more effectively than accusations of murder had done. His posture shifted slightly, the predatory focus returning to his gaze. "What sort of settlement?" he asked, caution and interest warring in his tone. "Complete surrender of all documentation regarding the silver vein," Eleanor stated flatly. "Maps, surveys, assay reports, everything Michael compiled before his death. In exchange for your sign and confession regarding your role in his death and subsequent attempts to seize our property." Hargrove's laugh held genuine amusement. "An absurd proposal. Why would I confess to crimes I haven't committed in exchange for documentation I'll acquire anyway once your husband's debts are properly adjudicated?" "Because Judge Freeman has already invalidated all debt claims against Eleanor," Jackson pointed out. "And because the silver vein alone is worth more than everything else you've accumulated in 10 years of operation." This was true according to Burns's assessment of the claim's potential value. The mother lode Michael had discovered could produce wealth far exceeding Hargrove's existing assets even before his legal troubles began dismantling his business empire. "A tempting fantasy," Hargrove acknowledged, "but fundamentally flawed. I'll be released within days of reaching Helena. These charges are built on the testimony of criminals and business rivals easily discredited by competent attorneys." Perhaps Eleanor agreed, allowing the possibility. But the claim's location remained secure, known only to those Michael trusted explicitly. Without the documentation, you could search for years without finding the exact site. She could see the calculation in Hargrove's eyes, weighing potential imprisonment against guaranteed wealth, immediate confession against future prospects. For a man like him, driven by acquisition rather than conscience, the decision matrix was complex but ultimately predictable. "An intriguing proposition," he said finally, "but fundamentally flawed. You see, Mrs. Wright, I no longer require your cooperation or documentation to secure what's mine." The subtle shift in his demeanor from calculated negotiation to quiet triumph sent warning signals through Eleanor's awareness. Before she could respond, Hargrove continued, his voice pitched for their ears alone, despite Sheriff Daniels' nearby presence. "Did you think I would come to this backwater without contingency plans, without ensuring my interests would be protected regardless of legal complications?" His cold smile never reached his eyes. "Even now, associates are securing the claim site based on information already in my possession." Eleanor felt her blood run cold. "That's impossible." "The location was ascertained weeks ago," Hargrove interrupted smoothly. "Your late husband was not as discreet in his explorations as he believed. My surveyors identified likely locations based on his movements, narrowing possibilities, until we located promising formations matching partial descriptions from various sources." Jackson's hand came to rest on Eleanor's shoulder, steady and reassuring, despite the disturbing revelation. "You're bluffing," he said calmly, "trying to manipulate us into revealing the actual location." "Am I?" Hargrove's expression suggested genuine amusement. "North face of Blackwater Ridge, distinctive rock formation resembling a bear's head. Creek running west to east across the approach." He raised an eyebrow at Eleanor's involuntary reaction to the accurate description. "Shall I continue, or have I established my point?" The details matched the map they had found in Michael's Bible, not precisely enough to locate the exact vein, perhaps, but certainly sufficient to identify the general area. If Hargrove had indeed sent men to secure the location— "Sheriff," Jackson called, his voice tight with sudden urgency, "we need to conclude this conversation immediately." Daniels approached, noting the tension with professional assessment. "Your 5 minutes are nearly up anyway. The transport wagon is ready." "There are armed men heading for Blackwater Ridge," Jackson informed him directly. "Hargrove's associates attempting to secure a valuable mining claim by force." The sheriff's expression shifted from confusion to alarm as he processed the implications. How many men? When did they depart? Ask him, Eleanor suggested, gesturing toward Hargrove, whose composed facade had finally begun to show cracks of annoyance at Jackson's intervention. Sheriff, this is absurd, Hargrove protested. They're attempting to delay my transport with wild accusations. But Daniels was already signaling to his deputies, issuing rapid instructions regarding potential armed trespassers in the Blackwater area. The commotion attracted attention from territorial marshals overseeing the prisoner transport, leading to hasty consultations and revised security arrangements. In the confusion, Eleanor leaned across the table toward Hargrove, her voice low but intense. You destroyed my first husband's life for that silver. You won't destroy my future as well. Something like genuine surprise flickered across Hargrove's features, perhaps at her directness or at the fierce determination in her previously reserved demeanor. You've changed, Mrs. Wright, he observed, unconsciously echoing Jackson's earlier assessment. Gained some backbone during your time with the giant. I've discovered my own strength, she corrected. Jackson simply recognized it before I did. Further conversation became impossible as marshals arrived to escort Hargrove to the waiting transport wagon. As he was led away, he glanced back once at Eleanor and Jackson, his expression combining calculation and something almost like respect beneath the evident frustration. What now? Eleanor asked, as they exited the hotel into Silver Creek's busy Main Street, where news of Hargrove's impending departure had drawn an even larger crowd. We ride for Blackwater Ridge, Jackson replied without hesitation. If Hargrove's men are already there, they may cause irreparable damage to the claim site before officials can intercept them. The urgency of their departure prevented extended discussion, but as they rode hard toward the mountains, Eleanor found herself reflecting on Hargrove's parting observation. She had changed during her time with Jackson, not because he had demanded or shaped her transformation, but because their partnership had created space for her native strength to emerge and flourish. The woman who had once hesitated to accept help chopping firewood now rode confidently toward potential confrontation with armed claim jumpers. The widow who had defined herself by loss and struggle now moved forward with purpose and determination, focused on securing future possibilities rather than merely surviving present challenges. Blackwater Ridge loomed before them after several hours of hard riding, its distinctive profile recognizable from the map they had studied. Jackson led them along a less direct approach than the main trail, using his knowledge of the terrain to provide cover and concealment as they neared the claim site. There, he murmured as they secured their horses in a sheltered draw. Movement near the Bearhead Formation. Eleanor followed his indicating gesture, spotting what appeared to be 3 or 4 men working near the distinctive rock outcropping Michael had marked on his map. Even from a distance, their activities were clearly more destructive than exploratory, using picks and shovels to create crude exploratory cuts, rather than the methodical sampling techniques proper geologists would employ. They're damaging the site, she whispered, dismayed by the visible scarring already evident on the hillside. If they continue, they could collapse access to the main vein. Jackson nodded grimly. That may be intentional. If Hargrove can't have the claim, he'll ensure no one else can develop it properly. The revelation of spite beyond mere greed aligned with what they had learned of Hargrove's character. A man who would destroy what he couldn't possess, regardless of its value to others or to the broader community. We need to stop them, Eleanor said, determination hardening into resolve, before they cause irreparable damage. Jackson studied the situation with practiced assessment. 4 men, all armed from what I can see. Difficult odds, especially in open terrain. Sheriff Daniels and his deputies should be on their way, Eleanor pointed out. If we can delay or distract Hargrove's men until reinforcements arrive. The strategy was risky but necessary given the ongoing destruction. Together they formulated a plan that utilized Jackson's military experience and Eleanor's knowledge of the claim details from Michael's documentation. Jackson would create a distraction from the western approach, drawing attention away from the main workings, while Eleanor circled to the eastern side where, according to Michael's notes, the most valuable section of the vein was located. If they could prevent damage to that critical area until official intervention arrived, the claim's primary value would remain intact. Be careful, Jackson said as they prepared to separate, his pale eyes holding hers with an intensity that communicated far more than the simple words. Stay hidden unless absolutely necessary. You too, she replied, resisting the urge to say more to acknowledge the depth of connection that had formed between them, the fear she felt not for the claim but for his safety. I'll meet you at the eastern outcropping when it's over. Their plan proceeded better than anticipated. Jackson's distraction, a controlled rock slide triggered from a strategic position, drew all four men away from their destructive work, allowing Eleanor to reach the critical eastern section unobserved. From her concealed position, she could monitor both the claim face and the continuing commotion Jackson orchestrated to maintain the men's diverted attention. The arrival of Sheriff Daniels and his deputies occurred with unexpected timing, just as Hargrove's men, growing suspicious of repeated distractions, began a systematic search of the surrounding area. The official intervention transformed what might have become a dangerous confrontation into a relatively orderly arrest, though not without brief resistance from the more belligerent claim jumpers. When Jackson finally joined Eleanor at their designated meeting point, his expression combined triumph and relief in equal measure. Claims secured, he reported, settling beside her on the rocky outcropping that overlooked the site Michael had discovered 2 years earlier. Sheriffs taking Hargrove's men to join their employer in custody. The damage they caused, superficial according to Burns. Jackson nodded toward a figure examining the workings below. Jim Burns had apparently accompanied the sheriff's party, his geological expertise proving invaluable in assessing the claim's condition. The main vein remains intact and accessible. Eleanor felt tension drain from her body, replaced by a profound weariness that seemed to reach her very bones. The culmination of weeks of danger and uncertainty, combined with the physical exertion of their hasty journey to Blackwater Ridge, left her simultaneously exhausted and exhilarated. "It's finally over," she murmured, gazing out over the landscape Michael had explored with such hope and secrecy. Hargrove neutralized the claim, secured justice for Michael's death, at least partially achieved. Jackson studied her profile in the late afternoon light. "What will you do now with the claim, I mean?" The question held implications beyond the immediate matter of the silver deposit. Their partnership had formed under specific circumstances, threat and necessity, creating bonds that might change shape as danger receded and options expanded. "Develop it properly," Eleanor said, after thoughtful consideration. "Not alone, but with partners I trust. Burns for his geological expertise, the Thompsons for their business connections, Thomas for his knowledge of local conditions and laborers." She turned to face Jackson, directly reading the unspoken question in his attentive gaze. "And you, if you're willing, not because of obligation or promises to Michael, but because we work well together, because what we've built these past weeks deserves to continue growing." On the invitation encompassed far more than business partnership, and they both recognized the deeper significance beneath practical considerations. Jackson's response came not in words but in action. His large hand covering hers where it rested on the sun-warmed stone between them, the gentle pressure communicating understanding and acceptance. They remained on the ridge until sunset painted the western sky in shades of gold and crimson, discussing practicalities of claim development, legal formalities, and community implications of their discovery. Throughout the conversation, their hands remained connected, a physical manifestation of the bond that had formed between them through shared danger and growing trust. As twilight gathered and temperatures began to drop, Jackson finally suggested they join the others for the journey back to Silver Creek. The silver claim would remain secure under deputy supervision until proper documentation could be filed and development formally initiated. "One question remains," Eleanor said as they collected their horses for the return journey. "Our original arrangement specified 1 month before any formal commitment. That period is nearly complete." Jackson nodded, his expression attentive, but revealing nothing of his thoughts on the matter. "It is. Given everything that's happened, all we've learned about each other through these challenges, do you still want that commitment?" The directness of her question matched his own characteristic straightforwardness. "Not out of obligation or promises to Michael, but because of what's developed between us." For a moment, Jackson remained silent, his scarred face thoughtful in the fading light. When he finally spoke, his deep voice carried the quiet certainty she had come to associate with his most genuine statements. "I proposed to you because I saw strength where others saw only vulnerability. I offered partnership when others offered pity. What's developed between us since then has only confirmed what I recognized from the beginning, that you are a woman worth building a life with whatever challenges that life might bring." He stepped closer, his massive frame somehow protective without being overwhelming. So yes, Eleanor, I still want that commitment now more than ever, but only if you're equally certain. The question hung between them, weighted with potential and possibility. Eleanor considered all that had transpired since Jackson's appearance during the blizzard, the dangers faced, secrets uncovered, trust established through action rather than mere words. I came to your mountain seeking security, she said finally. What I found was partnership, strength matching strength, respect growing into something deeper. She met his gaze directly, in honesty replacing the caution that had characterized her initial approach to their arrangement. Yes, Jackson, I'm certain. The simple exchange, lacking elaborate declarations or romantic flourishes, nevertheless cemented something profound between them, a commitment based on proven compatibility and mutual respect, rather than desperate circumstances or convenient solutions. As they mounted their horses for the journey home, Eleanor glanced back once at the ridge where Michael had discovered the silver vein that had ultimately cost his life. She would honor his memory through proper development of the claim, through creating the prosperity he had envisioned for her future. But that future now held possibilities. Michael could never have anticipated partnership with a giant of a man whose strength matched her own, whose patience had allowed her to discover capacities within herself previously untapped, whose unwavering support had transformed initial practical arrangement into genuine connection. The oath between them, spoken not in formal ceremony, but through actions and choices over weeks of shared challenge, bound them more securely than any traditional vows might have done. It was an oath between equals, forged in adversity and tempered by growing affection, as enduring as the mountains surrounding them, and as promising as the silver vein hidden beneath Blackwater Ridge. As they rode side by side toward home, their home, Eleanor felt certainty settle within her like bedrock. Whatever challenges awaited, whatever opportunities the silver claim might bring, they would face them together. Partners in all things, bound by choice rather than circumstance, their oath between heaven and earth, witnessed by mountains that had seen the rise and fall of countless human ambitions, yet endured unchanged. The future stretched before them, not a lonely widow and a solitary giant seeking practical solutions to separate problems, but a united force creating possibilities neither could have achieved alone. The oath between them would endure not because of external threat or pressing necessity, but because each had found in the other exactly what they needed: most recognition, respect, and the courage to build something lasting amid life's uncertainties. That was commitment worth making. That was partnership worth preserving. That was love worth cultivating through whatever seasons might come.